Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I still remember the first time I heard those footsteps, the heavy thud echoing in an otherwise silent corridor, my pulse already hammering from the start. Feeling that something wasn't right, I had chosen that tiny commercial room as my sanctuary, hoping to focus on my personal projects without the buzz of a busy office or the clamor of a shared workspace. The building itself was old, with a single flickering light outside by the parking lot. From the moment I walked in on my first evening, I felt an unsettling chill crawling across my skin. The hallway smelled of stale air and cleaning products, a stale mixture that did nothing to ease my unease. Even then, I dismissed it as first-day jitters, telling myself everything would feel normal once I settled into a routine, but normal never came. I had decided to sign the lease because the price was low and the area was quiet. The landlord mentioned the building's age, but he insisted it was structurally sound, just in need of some interior renovations that might happen at an unspecified time. I found my room on the top floor, an isolated corner with a single rectangular window that overlooked a narrow street during the day. Daylight dribbled in, painting the floor with dusty beams of sunlight at night. However, that window showed nothing but darkness, as if the world outside ceased to exist. After sunset, there was a sensation of claustrophobic quiet, an almost tangible pressure that made me catch my breath. Whenever I looked outside, searching in vain for city lights on my first night working late, I felt a curious mix of excitement and fear. The hallway was so dimly lit after a certain hour that it resembled a tunnel stretching into oblivion. I thought I heard something, a faint shuffle, perhaps someone else working on the same floor, but then I checked my watch, 9:00 p.m. The other tenants who worked normal 9-to-5 schedules had already gone home. The cleaning staff only came in the early morning, so I was sure the building was empty except for me. I brushed aside the notion that I wasn't alone, chalking it up to the building's old air vents. Sometimes old infrastructure mimics footsteps or whispering voices, so I tried to convince myself. By the end of that first week, I found it hard to ignore the footsteps. They had a deliberate cadence, like someone wearing leather-soled shoes, each step tapping the floor with a purposeful weight. I'd glance at the clock around 9:00 p.m. and feel my throat tighten, as if anticipating the dreaded sound the footsteps always began softly, a distant presence at the far end of the corridor. Then they would come closer, more distinct. My heart would pound faster with each echo, my palms growing damp breath catching in my chest. Eventually, they would pass right by my door, the steps reverberating against the walls, and fade into the blackness on the opposite side. Every time I bolted upright in my chair, terrified of confronting whatever was outside, yet a strange masochistic curiosity noted at me. I wanted to fling open that door and confirm there was nobody there. But for several nights, I just sat there paralyzed, feeling my stomach twist in knots one evening. My nerves had been gnawing at me all day. Deadlines loomed, and I was behind on a project. The entire building felt colder than usual, and I nearly jumped out of my skin each time the radiator clanked in the corner of my office when the clock read 8:57 p.m. I stood up with my heart racing, determined not to let my fear overpower me. I reasoned that if there really was a person out there, I should be able to see them coming. So I waited, hand hovering over the doorknob like I was preparing to detonate a bomb. The footsteps started as always, faint at first, gradually rising in volume. My breath turned shallow and a film of cold sweat beaded on my forehead. My legs trembled like they might give out at any moment when the steps sounded just beyond my door. I gritted my teeth, twisted the knob, and yanked the door open. Darkness. The corridor's overhead lights were off, leaving only a weak glow from the emergency sign at the far end of the hall. My first impression was that I was staring into a void, an impenetrable black. I tried blinking, hoping my eyes would adjust, but I couldn't see a single outline that resembled a human being. Yet the footsteps continued. I heard them so close that it felt as though someone was brushing past me. My heart thundered. My head pounded with the rush of blood. My mouth went dry as I fought the urge to shout or run. I stood there, a pathetic statue of fear, unable to do anything but watch the empty black. Then the footsteps tapered away as if moving around a corner that didn't physically exist, and I was left alone in silence. I must have stood there with the door open for a full minute before my senses returned. My hand shook when I finally closed the door, and for the rest of the night I couldn't concentrate on my work. I kept replaying the moment in my head. There was no figure, no silhouette, no flicker of movement. Yet the sound was undeniable, as real as my own racing heartbeat. I considered the possibility that I was imagining things. Maybe stress was getting the better of me, perhaps a psychological phenomenon. Sometimes the brain hears is what it fears the most, but deep down I wasn't convinced it felt too real. The following week I tried to gather information in a subtle way. I asked the landlord if anyone else rented space on my floor, and if they worked late. He shook his head and said no one else had renewed their lease on that wing of the building. Budgets were tight, and only I had shown any interest in that otherwise deserted corridor. He joked that I must enjoy solitude, to which I responded with a vague smile. I mentioned hearing some noises at night, but he only shrugged. He said old buildings make all kinds of sounds, and if I needed anything, I could call his emergency line. That conversation left me feeling uneasy. If the landlord himself had no explanation, then I was truly alone in this mystery night. After night, the same experience repeated around 9 p.m. Those footsteps manifested out of nowhere, echoing with that ominous steady rhythm. My body reacted the same way every time my pulse hammered. My breathing went ragged, and I had to wipe sweat from my brow. I tried turning on loud music, thinking maybe I could drown out the noises. It made no difference. Even over my headphones, I could detect those footsteps reverberating as if the entire hallway were a drum. I tried leaving the door open at 8:45 p.m., lights on full, hoping that if I spotted something right away, it would resolve the situation. The footsteps still came slicing through the silence, but no one ever appeared in the doorway. It felt like an invisible presence was crossing back and forth before my eyes. Over time, the atmosphere in my small office grew more oppressive. The overhead fluorescent lamp flickered, sometimes casting warped shadows along the walls. The radiator hissed at the strangest moments, releasing bursts of musty-smelling heat that made me sweat. Even though the rest of the space was oddly cold, I felt as if the walls were closing in on me. My reflection in the dark window became a blurry reminder of how unsettled I was. On some nights, I thought I saw the faint shape of a silhouette behind me in the reflection, but whenever I turned around, the office was empty. The fear began to gnaw at me so relentlessly that I started to question. My reality was my mind. Conjuring illusions, was I losing track of what was real? I attempted to reassure myself perhaps this was just an elaborate trick of an overworked brain, or maybe there was a structural quirk in the building's design causing the acoustics to mimic footsteps. But my rational excuses started to crumble when I felt the vibrations through the floor one night. After hearing the steps outside, I crouched near the door and pressed my palm against the cold tile. Each footfall sent a faint tremor into my hand, a real physical movement. It felt unshakably present. I jerked my hand away, hard in my throat. Realizing that no hallucination would generate that kind of vibration, that moment pushed my paranoia to a new height. I started dreading evenings, watching the clock with a sense of impending doom. Even earlier in the day, I'd catch myself flinching at random sounds, a door creaking elsewhere in the building, a distant honk from the street, or the hum of the ancient ventilation system. My muscles tensed involuntarily, my jaw remained clenched, and I developed a near-constant tension headache. Any conversation I had with friends or colleagues about my new workspace occurred indirectly. I'd vaguely say that the building was creepy or unsettling, but I never confessed the full extent of my fears. I worried they'd label me paranoid or delusional. Eventually, my work suffered so badly that I realized I had to confront whatever was lurking in that corridor. On a Thursday night, I steeled my nerves and devised a plan. I'd arrive just before dusk, set up a camera to record audio and video from the corridor, and keep every single light on. If there was an explanation, an intruder, or a misfiring system, I would catch it. That evening, the building felt more sinister than ever. Even the elevator ride was unnerving, its fluorescent bulb flickering just enough to throw my pulse into overdrive. Once I reached my floor, I installed the camera in front of my door, angling it to capture the entire length of the corridor. Then I retreated into my office, forcing myself to breathe slowly when 9 p.m. approached. I positioned myself behind my door, ready to pop out at the slightest sound. The footsteps began like clockwork, a distant knocking on the far side of the corridor. My heartbeat thundered in response, and I felt my breath stick in my throat this time. I forced my legs to move. I swung the door open while the footsteps were still reverberating. The corridor lay empty, though the footsteps continued just a few feet away from me. It was as though an invisible figure marched in plain sight, defying any logic. My entire body went numb with terror. I reached out in the darkness, hand quivering, and felt nothing but cold air, and then abruptly the footsteps stopped leaving me, panting in the stillness. I examined the camera footage after my pulse settled. Somewhat, the hallway lights had flickered at the exact moment I heard the steps. The audio recorded the sound of footsteps crisp and unam ambiguous, but the video showed no movement, no shape. It looked as if I had opened the door to chase empty shadows. That final piece of evidence was the tipping point. I felt a wave of raw dread more potent than anything I'd experienced before the building was either haunted or messing with my senses in a way I couldn't endure. My mind reeled with the realization that there might be something beyond my rational understanding at work. I knew I had had to leave the feeling of being constantly observed. The thick dread in the halls and the bizarre evidence on my recording all convinced me that my sanity was more valuable than any cheap rent or quiet working environment. I came in one last time during daylight hours to pack my things. Even then, the building exuded that icy aura. Every creak of the floor echoed like a warning. My chest felt heavy, and a sheen of perspiration dampened my collar. By the time I hauled my final box to the car, I was trembling so hard that I almost dropped it. I never found out what caused those footsteps. I never demanded an explanation from the landlord beyond what he could offer. Because I sensed it was an exercise in futility, some occurrences defy rational explanation. I escaped that old commercial space with my work in shambles and my nights haunted by phantom echoes. Even now, whenever I pass by an empty corridor, my pulse quickens. A tiny part of me expects to hear that same firm, heavy tread. I can't shake the feeling that the presence in that hallway was something more than a mere quirk of an aging building. In the end, I fled from whatever walked those halls at night, yet a piece of my mind is forever trapped back there. Listening, waiting, dreading that echo of impossibly real footsteps, and that final thought leaves me with a chill that no daylight can ever quite chase away on the air. In that building always felt stale, as though it had been trapped behind its grimy walls for decades, aging right alongside the dusty beams and crumbling bricks. The first time I stepped inside, something about the darkness in the corners made my skin crawl. Yet I brushed off the discomfort, telling myself that an old structure naturally carries its own peculiar atmosphere. I was eager to open my small antique store, and the property seemed perfect for my goals. Especially the spacious basement, which promised ample storage for my ever-growing collection of oddities. Little did I know that the shadows in that place would take on a life of their own, feeding on my doubts and gnawing at my sanity. I remember the day I signed the lease. The landlord, a gray-haired man with a furrowed brow, offered no welcoming smile. Instead, he described the building's questionable wiring and mentioned how rarely it had been occupied in the last few years. I wondered why no one stayed for long, but he didn't elaborate. He only mumbled something about the place having its quirks at the time. I assumed he was referring to the usual inconveniences of an older building, unreliable. Plumbing, flickering lights, perhaps a roach or two. I never imagined anything beyond that. If he knew more, he never said it outright. His eyes, however, reflected a kind of relief as he handed me the keys like he was passing on a heavy burden. The first few days were surprisingly pleasant. I set up the ground floor with shelves and glass cases, carefully placing trinkets and antique curios I had collected over time. The building's creaking floorboards became a familiar soundtrack, and the occasional flicker of the overhead lights simply reminded me to schedule an electrician's visit. In the evenings, I would carry boxes down the old staircase to the basement. It was dimly lit by a single naked bulb, the stone walls perpetually cool to the touch. There were no windows, just thick concrete and a persistent chill that settled in my bones if I stayed too long. Nevertheless, I felt secure enough in that subterranean space, at least initially. Everything changed during my first late-night visit to retrieve a forgotten ledger. I had stayed well past closing. Organizing and exhausted, I realized I needed some documents I'd left in a box downstairs when I descended the steps. Flashlight in hand, I heard something that made me freeze in place. It sounded like muffled voices, as though two people were engaged in a hushed conversation. Just around the corner, the realization that I shouldn't be hearing anyone else at that hour sent a jolt of cold adrenaline through my veins. My flashlight trembled in my grip, and I felt my heart pound so hard it nearly echoed in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was the old plumbing, or maybe noise from the street filtering through some hidden gap in the foundation. I stood still. For a moment, struggling to calm my racing pulse and slow my breathing. The murmur of voices continued, stopping and starting with a rhythm that seemed undeniably human. Yet when I directed my flashlight around the basement, I saw no one. My sweat turned clammy as I forced myself to walk around the shelves and piles of boxes, methodically checking every corner. There was no sign of intrusion, no leftover footprints in the dust, nothing at all that indicated a physical presence. The voices were gone, or perhaps they had never been there in the first place. I nearly laughed at how rattled I felt. Over the next few days, I tried not to think about that strange encounter. Work kept me busy, and the hustle of setting up new merchandise left me little room for doubt. However, each night the memory returned. It seemed so vivid, so real that my attempts to dismiss it as imagination felt almost dishonest. Still, for nearly a week, the basement remained quiet. I went downstairs several times to grab items or sort through boxes, and the only sounds were the squeaking floorboards above my head or the distant hum of traffic outside. It lulled me into a false sense of security until it happened again. One evening, around the same late hour, I heard it once more, that same low, whispery conversation with abrupt pauses and slight inflections. My throat went dry and my legs tensed. Despite the flood of anxiety, I forced myself to investigate again. I flicked on the overhead light, which sputtered unli before illuminating the center of the basement in a weak glow. My flashlight scanned the shelves, revealing nothing but dusty crates. The voices continued for a few moments, then abruptly stopped when I spoke aloud in a quivering voice, asking if anyone was there. Silence swallowed every corner, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. My body trembled in response, and beads of cold sweat gathered along my hairline. What unnerved me most was the way those voices seemed to get progressively clearer each time they returned. Their tones and intonations grew sharper, pressing against my ears, yet I could never make out the exact words. Whenever I tried to listen more carefully, the murmur dissolved into a wash of static-like nonsense. I started wondering if I was losing my mind, if perhaps the stress of running a new business was taking its toll. But the raw physical reactions I felt, my pounding heart, the tightness in my chest, the shortness of breath, convinced me something more. Sinister was at play. My paranoia deepened. I found myself flinching at every stray creak and groan, every flicker of light, every accidental brush of a cobweb against my skin. During the day, I wandered the store in a distracted haze. Customers occasionally asked if I was feeling all right, and I would mutter an excuse about being tired. Yet the moment dusk fell, an uneasiness crept over me, as if the darkness outside was a herald. For something lurking beneath my feet, I attempted to record the sounds. One night, carrying a small voice recorder, I stood in the B basement, nearly hyperventilating from the tension. The air down there felt heavier, colder than ever before. My breath emerged in shallow gasps, and a faint tremor invaded my limbs. Nothing happened at first. No voices, just the hum of my own anxious silence. But after a few minutes, that low, swatting conversation returned. I strained to keep steady. Bracing myself against a wooden shelf for support, the weight of unseen eyes burned at the back of my neck, and the space felt claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in after collecting myself. I sprinted upstairs with the recorder, determined to find proof. When I played it back, I heard absolutely nothing. No faint whispers, no hush chatter, only my own tense breathing and a kind of static that resembled a distant wind. The failure of that recording nearly shattered my confidence in my own faculties. Was I hallucinating? Had I become so consumed by the building's eerie atmosphere that my mind fabricated these voices I considered seeking professional advice, or even leaving the place altogether? But the store had started turning a modest profit, and I felt strangely compelled to keep going. Something about the mystery drew me in a mayou. Fascination that both terrified and intrigued me. One particularly suffocating night, I decided to remain in the basement for a prolonged stretch, determined to confront whatever press lurked there. I brought a chair, a camping lantern, and a thermos of coffee, aiming to stay until dawn if necessary. At first, the space was dead silent, the only interruptions being my heartbeat pounding in my chest and the occasional drip of condensation along the cold stone walls. As time crawled forward, my eyelids grew heavy and tension built within my chest. My entire body was on alert, every nerve screaming for me to flee. Yet I forced myself to remain, sweat gathering on my temples. My muscles taut as I scanned the darkness for any flicker of movement. Eventually, the whispering began again, soft, insistent, and maddeningly incomprehensible. My hands trembled so violently that I nearly dropped my flashlight. I tried to focus on the timbre of the voices, attempting to discern gender or mood. They sounded neither exactly male nor female, more like two disembodied murmurs overlapping in a bizarre harmony. I wanted to shout at them to demand they show themselves, but my words died in my throat instead. I sat there trapped between fear and fascination, waiting for the next wave of terror. That was when I noticed something shifting in the far corner just beyond the lantern's dim glow. It was a shape, a ripple in the darkness that made me shudder to the core. My heart hammered so violently that black spots swam at the edges of my vision. I strained to see better, but the shape receded into the blackness. The voices continued as if beckoning me deeper. My entire body felt suffocated by an invisible weight pressing against my chest, making each breath a struggle in a desperate burst of courage. I stood up and shone my flashlight toward that corner, stepping forward. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run, the air felt thick, almost syrupy, as if it fought my every movement. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. The voices reached a crescendo, then not loud but urgent, their murmurs spinning around me like a vortex. I felt a sudden pressure on my ears, a pop that almost resembled a change in atmospheric pressure, and then everything went silent in one terrifying instant. No whispering, no rustling in the darkness, just an oppressive quiet so complete it made my ears ring. I couldn't endure it any longer. My legs threatened to give out as I turned and sprinted up the stairs, nearly tripping over the last step in my haste to escape. My heart pounded like a drum sweat soaking the back of my shirt. Once upstairs, I locked the basement door behind me, leaning against it as though it alone could keep whatever lurked below it. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a presence looming behind me. Whispering nonsense into my ear, I woke up multiple times, drenched in cold sweat, images of that shifting darkness etched into my mind. The next morning, I made a decision I would not allow whatever inhabited that basement to trap me in fear. Instead, I began searching for any clue about the building's history. Rummaging through old files in the local archives, my findings were sparse references to minor renovations, details about previous businesses that never stayed more than a couple of years. None of the documents offered a clear explanation for the voices. They simply confirmed that people left abruptly, sometimes without giving notice. That final night in the building, I decided to pack up my more valuable antiques and store them elsewhere, telling myself it was only a precaution until I could figure out a permanent solution. As I moved through the empty store, the faint hum of the city outside felt oddly distant. My nerves were frayed, my senses heightened to the point of paranoia. The overhead lights flickered, my throat was painfully dry, and each swallow felt like sandpaper. When I finally made my last trip up the basement steps, I felt those muffled voices trickling up behind me, soft and persistent. I froze momentarily, cheeks flushing with terror. In that moment, I realized those whispers would never stop, that they were part of the building itself. A manifestation of something ancient and unresolved, unable to face another second of that subterranean pressure. I rushed to lock the basement door for good before leaving. I allowed myself one last look down the dark staircase. My flashlight illuminated the cramped space, only partially, leaving much of it still swallowed by darkness. I felt the air change as though something below recognized my departure. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end and my heartbeat hammered in my ears. One final time without a backward glance, I shut the door and turned the key. I don't know what lingered in that basement or what its intentions were even now. When I think about the nights I spent listening to those unfathomable whispers, my stomach knots and my palms turned clammy. There are moments I question whether it was ever real. Moments when I try to rationalize it as a side effect of stress and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I feel certain that something resides in the shadows of that ancient building. Something that neither belongs to the living nor acknowledges my reality in any comprehensible way. I left that place soon after renting a different spot across town to continue my antiques business, yet even in a new building with bright lights and fresh paint, I catch myself hesitating. Whenever I reach for a basement door, a part of me expects to hear those muted voices again, whispering in that disjointed language forever trapped in dark corners just out of sight. And that lingering dread, that subtle questioning of my own senses remains with me like a permanent stain. An unsettling reminder that some echoes refuse to fade no matter how far I run. I felt the chill before I even saw the corridor. It was the kind of penetrating cold that crawls under your skin and settles in your bones, far beyond what any summer breeze or drafty window could explain the first time I stepped into that narrow passage. My breath caught in my throat and a sudden wave of unease washed over me. Even though sunlight streamed through the windows in the rest of the house, the air in that cramped space felt stagnant and unnaturally cold. It was as if some invisible force lurked there, watching and waiting. Waiting with silent anticipation. I had inherited this country house from a distant relative I barely knew, and I initially thought it would be a pleasant getaway from my hectic city life. The building stood on a large plot of land surrounded by tall, unkempt grass and dense clusters of trees. The paint on the exterior walls had faded to a dull shade of gray. Loose shutters slapped against the siding with each gust of wind, adding an eerie percussion to the place's overall silence. I remember looking at it from the gravel driveway and wondering if I'd have the time or motivation to restore it to a more hospitable state. Inside, I found dusty furniture covered in sheets, an old fireplace coated with years of soot, and various antique trinkets stacked in corners. My first weekend there, I spent most of my time cleaning and rearranging. What little furniture I planned to keep the house had a peculiar smell, an earthy scent of old wood and something faintly sweet that I couldn't place. It wasn't unpleasant, just unfamiliar, a reminder that I was stepping into someone else's memories rather than a place of my own. Yet it wasn't these remnants of the past that bothered me. It was that corridor positioned between the kitchen and a small guest bedroom. The corridor measured only about 10 feet in length. It had no windows and was illuminated by a single weak light bulb dangling from the ceiling. Despite the rest of the house being warm or even stuffy, that tight stretch of hallway felt like a different world. Breathlessly cold, suffocating, and thick with an unspoken tension. The first time I crossed it, I simply shrugged it off, attributing my discomfort to exhaustion. But each time I walked through afterward, the same piercing chill hit me, and I felt as if something brushed against the back of my neck. At first, I tried rational explanations. Maybe an old ventilation shaft passed through there, or perhaps a hidden air current trickled through cracks in the walls. I performed a cursory inspection. I checked for leaks, electrical wiring issues, or moldy spots. Anything that might cause a temperature drop, I found. None. The plaster remained intact and the floorboards were solid. There were no open vents or exposed pipes still. That place felt wrong no matter how many times I walked the rest of the hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that in that narrow passage something was observing me. On the second weekend, I decided to stay the night and see if I could detect the source of the cold at different times. That was when I heard the murmuring lying in bed with the lights off. I started to drift into an uneasy sleep. My heartbeat pulsed in my ears, and the old house's natural sounds, a gentle creaking of the wooden beams, an occasional rustle of leaves against the window, lulled me into a half-dream state. Then I heard a soft, muffled conversation as though multiple voices whispered behind a closed door. My eyes snapped open and I strained to listen. It was coming from the corridor. I got up shivering with a combination of fear and the lingering cold in the air. My stomach tightened and my hands felt numb. I remember my pulse pounding in my temples as I stepped gingerly toward the corridor's entrance. I flipped the light switch and the single bulb flared to life. The moment the light flooded the passage, the whispering ceased. An uneasy stillness took over. All that remained was that stifling cold, as if it clung to my skin, refusing to let go. I didn't dare walk any farther instead. I turned around and headed back to my bedroom, convinced I was imagining things. The more time I spent in that house, the more I questioned my perception. I couldn't dismiss the strange atmosphere as mere paranoia. It was too tangible, too immediate. One afternoon, as I walked through the corridor carrying some cleaning supplies, I felt certain something brushed against my elbow. My heart hammered against my ribcage, adrenaline coursed through me, and I dropped a bag of rags. I spun around so quickly that I nearly lost my balance. The corridor was empty. Nobody stood behind me. No stray animal scurried away. Nothing, yet the sensation of someone standing right at my back remained. My instincts told me to leave after all. No one forced me to remain there. However, I felt an odd pull, a need to uncover whatever lurked in those walls. Curiosity and a tinge of stubborn pride kept me tethered to the house, determined to reclaim it from this unseen presence. One evening after another disturbing round of strange whispers, I resolved to do a thorough nighttime investigation. I equipped myself with a flashlight and a notebook, telling myself that if I just gathered enough evidence, I could prove it was all in my head, or at least figure out a rational explanation. I paced the corridor carefully, checking every panel. Every inch of the walls I knocked gently, listening for hollow spots that might indicate a hidden space. The corridor answered with dull, solid thuds. No secret compartments, no hidden trap doors. I even tried to measure temperature differences. I stepped into the kitchen, then into the corridor, then the guest bedroom. Using an old thermometer I found in a drawer, the readings should have varied only slightly, but the drop within that 10-foot space was dramatic. Nearly 15 degrees colder than the kitchen at the guest bedroom's entrance. The temperature returned to something tolerable. It was impossible to attribute that kind of change to normal conditions. The physical toll of this exploration weighed on me. My chest felt tight and my forehead beaded with sweat. Despite the cold, my breathing grew shallow each time I crossed the threshold. Every corner of my brain screamed that I wasn't alone. Though my eyes kept telling me otherwise, the house felt smaller, as if its walls were inching closer, drawing me into that corridor's suffocating darkness. An acquaintance who heard about my inherited property visited one afternoon. Though I tried to avoid speaking directly about my fears, I mentioned that the corridor felt unusually cold. Old, that acquaintance asked if I had installed some hidden air conditioner. I remembered smiling awkwardly, trying to brush off the question. I hinted that it was just a draft, but my mind roiled with the memory of that thermometer reading and the whispered voices when we walked through the corridor together. I noticed how quickly he hurried his pace. He didn't say anything yet. His expression darkened and he avoided eye contact. Once we reached the other side as he left, he joked in an unconvincing tone that I should get that corridor checked out. I could sense he felt something too. Nighttime in that house became an ordeal. Trying to sleep while anticipating the faint murmur was worse than hearing them. My ears attuned to every creak and groan played cruel tricks on me. One night I thought I heard soft scratching along the hallway walls. I jolted out of bed, my heart rattling in my chest. I stood there by the bedroom door, hand trembling on the knob, debating whether to open it. The darkness on the other side felt alive, pulsing with malevolence. I imagined pale hands reaching out, beckoning me to step into that cold place my skin crawled, and every hair on my body stood on end. Eventually, I forced myself to open the door, only to find that the corridor's light was out. The bulb that had worked fine just hours ago now lay shattered on the floor, tiny shards of glass glinting. The corridor yawned before me, a black void. My stomach churned and a wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm me. I retreated and stayed awake for hours each minute. Steeped in dread, my mouth felt dry as if I had swallowed sand. I tried to calm my nerves by telling myself it must have been some electrical fault or a sudden surge that caused the bulb to burst. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was rejecting me, punishing me for my attempts to pry into its secrets. In the following days, I experienced more unsettling occurrences. The cold corridor never let me forget its presence. I started noticing odd shadows flickering at the periphery of my vision, always near that space. A dark shape would slide across the floor, disappearing the instant I glanced over. My anxiety reached a fever pitch. My hands trembled constantly and my muscles tense to the point of aching. When I did manage to sleep, my dreams were plagued by faceless silhouettes drifting through the corridor, whispering in low, urgent tones. One afternoon, I decided enough was enough. I told myself that if I confronted this head-on, maybe I could drive away whatever lurked there, armed with a new light bulb. I approached the corridor, determined to prove I was still in charge. The cold assaulted me sharper than ever, pricking at my skin. I replaced the bulb, my finger shaking so badly I could barely screw it in. Then I flipped the switch, bathing the corridor in a pale glow with the core lit. I stepped into its center, the chill engulfed me entirely. Each ragged breath crystallized. The dread. sanity silently waiting for you to return. I still remember the first night I spent in that place. The air seemed stale, and every sound echoed strangely in the long hallway that led to my new bedroom. Even before I set foot inside, I sensed there was something off about that ground floor apartment from the 1950s. My skin prickled the moment I closed the door behind me, as though I were stepping into a space where I was not entirely welcome. I brushed off the unease as the typical nerves of moving somewhere unfamiliar. Little did I know that the discomfort would only grow more intense in the days to come. I moved my boxes into the apartment's main bedroom, quickly noticing the single piece of furniture left behind an antique mirror leaning against the wall. The frame was heavy and carved with intricate floral details. The wood darkened by time, the glass itself was slightly fogged at the edges, tinted a dull gray. At first I thought it was charming. An interesting vintage accent that fit the old structure of the building. Perhaps the previous tenant had found it too cumbersome to take along. The property manager had only told me the place was being vacated in a hurry. Giving no further explanation, I decided the mirror should stay, convincing myself it added character. During the first few weeks, I arranged my belongings, worked my regular shifts, and tried to settle into a routine. The apartment was quiet, with thick walls that muffled any noise from the neighbors. The building's corridors had dim lighting that flickered unpredictably, casting long, unsettling shadows. The floors creaked and the old pipes groaned whenever water was used. If I were to describe the atmosphere in a single word, I would call it heavy oppressive, in a way I couldn't quite articulate at night. When I switched off the lights, a persistent hush would envelop the rooms, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator or the occasional drip from the bathroom faucet. It was during these dark hours that I started noticing something peculiar about the mirror. If I walked by the bedroom door without turning on the light, I'd catch what looked like a shape standing in the reflection. It was nothing concrete. More of a suggestion than a real figure, but it was enough to unsettle me, prickling my scalp and speeding up my heartbeat. I told myself it was a trick of the mind, a product of tired eyes adjusting to the dark. Yet the feeling persisted. Night after night, my chest would tighten each time I saw that vague silhouette, like an imprint of someone who shouldn't be there. Sometimes I would see a slight shift, as if whatever it was had just moved. My breathing would grow shallow and a cold sweat would break out along my hairline. More than once I felt goosebumps spread across my arms as I hurried to another room, flicking on every light switch I could reach. Perhaps I was imagining it all. I tried to reassure myself that old mirrors often have discoloration or stains, creating illusions in low light. But a small knot of fear took root in my stomach, making me dread walking past the bedroom after sunset. I developed the habit of leaving the door closed most of the time, especially at night. Still, the knowledge that the mirror lurked on the other side of that door never left my mind. I found myself unable to sleep peacefully, jolting awake at random intervals, convinced that someone or something was watching me. My dreams became murky, filled with flickering images of that reflective glass and a looming presence I could never quite see head-on. I considered removing the mirror or storing it somewhere out of sight, but part of me felt almost embarrassed, as if I were giving in to an unfounded paranoia. It was, after all, just a mirror. The days passed, my tension mounting with each sunset. My breathing would grow labored whenever I approached the bedroom, a sense of dread pressing on my chest. If I left work late, I'd find myself preparing excuses to enter through the living room window rather than past the bedroom door. It was illogical, but fear has a way of warping our better judgment. At one point, I mentioned my restlessness to a co-worker. He remarked that moving into a place with a history often felt unsettling, especially if the previous tenant had been in a rush. He asked if the property manager had said anything about the last occupant. I recall that the manager only offered a vague explanation. The previous person left abruptly, leaving behind several items, including that mirror. My coworker shrugged, implying that it could be a sign of personal troubles or a sudden need for relocation. My stomach churned when I thought about it. What kind of troubles? Force someone to leave a heavy antique mirror behind. Night after night, the mirror became an obsession. I tried not to look directly at it. If I had to enter the bedroom when it was dark, I would keep my gaze fixed on the floor, turning on the overhead light before I dared glance at the reflection. Even then, I sometimes sensed movement at the edge of my vision, something slithering in the background as though the glass were alive with a dark current. My head would pound and my pulse would race until I forced myself to look again, seeing nothing but my own strained expression. The turning point arrived one particularly exhausting evening. I had come home late, drained from a long shift. My nerves were already frayed and I was too tired to tiptoe around. My fear the bedroom door was ajar and the lights were off. As I walked down the corridor, I registered that shape in the mirror once more, except this time it wasn't just a smudge. It stood there, tall, outlined against the gloom as if it possessed tangible form. My heart hammered so hard that I felt it in my throat, and my palms instantly went clammy. My breath caught, and for a moment I froze, too terrified to blink. A jolt of anger overcame me, then fueled by my growing frustration and exhaustion, I decided that I'd had enough of this lurking dread. I marched into the room, not bothering to turn on the light. My logic was shaky at best, but adrenaline guided me, pushing me to confront what I believed must be a hallucination or a paranoid delusion. I stared straight into the mirror for a fraction of a second. I was certain I saw a human-like silhouette at the edges, rippling and twisting within the glass. My stomach dropped and every hair on my body stood on end. Then in the instant it took me to flip the light switch, it vanished. The room was empty, just me and the old furniture. My body trembled uncontrollably. I could taste the metallic tang of fear in my mouth, and my breathing came in shallow gasps. I thought I might be losing my mind. I spent the next day in a fog, replaying that glimpse over and over. Was it a hallucination brought on by fatigue or something else entirely? I felt a pressing weight at the back of my skull, and every time I closed my eyes, I recalled the shape's unnaturally fluid outline. After agonizing all afternoon, I decided I couldn't tolerate the mirror any longer. I intended to drag it outside, maybe store it in the building's basement, or even leave it next to the dumpster if necessary. That very even-I-steeled myself, I approached the bedroom with every light in the apartment. On my pulse was pounding like a drum in my ears, but my resolve was firm. The mirror was coming out, and that was final. I placed my hands on either side of the frame and tried to lift it. It didn't budge. The weight was enormous, more than I'd anticipated, and the carved wood had an almost sticky feel against my palms. I could swear a low whisper filled the room, but I couldn't pinpoint its source. My throat went dry as I mustered my strength, but my arms shook too much to lift it properly. It felt as though it were bolted to the floor, though I could see no brackets holding it down. Panting, I released my grip and stumbled backward. My knees threatened to give out, and a cold trickle of sweat ran down my spine. I stared at the mirror, half expecting to see that silhouette again. The glass was vacant, reflecting the overhead bulb and my own tense figure, fig shoulders hunched and face bead. With sweat, feeling as though the oxygen had been drained from the room, I retreated, pulling the door shut behind me. That night, I barely slept. Every rustle outside my window made my heart skip a beat. The old pipes clanked as if someone were hammering on them. I felt certain that if I drifted off, I would hear that subtle whisper again. Or worse, see that silhouette inside my dream. By morning, my eyes were bloodshot and my nerves frayed beyond belief. Over the next few days, I spiraled into a state of jumpy paranoia. Every corner seemed to hide a reflection. Every reflective surface, a window, a polished metal spoon, reminded me of that impossible figure. My appetite vanished, replaced by a constant knot of anxiety in my gut. My hands quivered at work, and I found it impossible to focus on anything for longer than in a few minutes. People asked if I was all right, and I mumbled some excuse about having trouble sleeping. Eventually, I resolved to confront my fear one last time. A friend, through indirect conversation, mentioned that sometimes we need to face what scares us and see if it's real or just in our minds. The comment stung my pride, but it gave me a surge of determination. One final confrontation if I couldn't remove the mirror physically. Perhaps I could mentally break the hold it had on me, so I waited until late, making sure the apartment was silent. Then I turned off every light, letting darkness swallow the rooms. My palms were slick with sweat, and my heart thrummed in my chest like a warning. Bell. I approached the bedroom door, hearing only the faint rush of blood in my ears. I opened the door. Slowly, the air inside was cooler, as if the room had been sealed away for ages. I forced myself to cross the threshold and stand in front of the mirror, guided only by a strip of moonlight slipping in through the curtains. At first, I saw nothing but my shadowy outline, then a flicker in the periphery. Slight shift in the glass, as though something stirred behind me. My stomach clenched, and I felt an icy flush wash over my face. I exhaled a shaky breath and willed myself. Not to flinch, the silhouette grew more defined, as if stepping forward from behind a veil of darkness. My temples pounded with such force that I thought I might pass out. I felt the mirror's presence pressing against me, and for a moment my reflection looked like a distorted figure with hollows. Where the eye should be a surge of primal fear nearly overtook me, but I managed to hold my ground. I shut my eyes and summoned the courage to speak aloud. Just a single shaky statement telling whatever it was that it had no power over me. My voice sounded weak, yet it resonated in the oppressive cool quiet. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone, leaving only my reflection. The air felt lighter, as though something had loosened its grip on the space. The next morning, I discovered the mirror leaning harmlessly against the wall. No longer quite so heavy in my mind, I wrapped it in a large cloth and carefully removed it from the bedroom. It took all my strength, and my arms quivered, but this time it moved without the eerie resistance I had felt before I stored it out of sight in a corner of a storage area at the end of the building's corridor. Since that day, I haven't sensed that presence again, though. A lingering unease remains every time I walk past that storage room door. Even now, recounting those events makes my heart race and my palms sweat. I can't fully explain what happened or why the mirror had such a hold on me. Part of me wonders if I allowed my imagination to run wild, feeding on the building's inherent gloom and my own stress. Another part remains convinced there was something genuinely malevolent in that reflection. Something that found a conduit in my fear. To this day, I can't bring myself to look into old mirrors if I enter an antique shop or visit a friend's vintage decorated home. I feel a tremor of unease the moment I catch my own reflection in cloudy glass. Though I never saw the silhouette again, the memory of that creeping shape still flickers in the corners of my vision. Sometimes making my heart pound and my mouth go dry, and whenever I think of that apartment's bedroom, I'm reminded that some places harbor energies we can't understand. Echoes or shadows that exist just beyond the threshold of normal perception. I escaped, but I'll carry that lingering dread forever. I first noticed something was off the moment I stepped inside. That old house, the air was stagnant, carrying a faint odor of dust mingled with mold. Every creak of the floor felt like a whispered warning. Even the light seemed wrong, pale and hesitant, as if it was being choked by the gloom seeping out of every corner. I remember pausing on the threshold, my heart thawing dully in my chest, my palms already damp with sweat, and thinking that the house itself was waiting for me to enter. Watching from within, my friend had purchased the place a few months earlier. It was a 1930s construction perched on a slight hill, surrounded by withered trees that rustled whenever the wind picked up. He had asked if I could help him with renovations, simple tasks like clearing debris, priming walls, and hauling out junk. It seemed straightforward enough, and I'd always enjoyed that kind of hands-on work, but the more time I spent there, the heavier the atmosphere felt. It was as if the house had a pulse of its own, and I could feel it reverberating through the floorboards. I remember climbing the narrow staircase to the attic for the first time, my chest tight with the musty air. The single overhead light bulb dangled from the rafters, casting long, jittery shadows against the angled ceiling. Old trunks boxes and yellowed newspapers littered the floor. Cobwebs spanned between the beams, and each step sent dust motes swirling around the far corner held a worn leather armchair beneath a small circular window. Its silhouette looked strangely human, in the gloom contoured like someone had just been sitting and left for only a moment. I couldn't say why, but I felt distinctly unsettled by that armchair, as if it were scrutinizing me. Even before I got close, at first I tried to brush off my unease. There was work to do, and I didn't want to appear skittish. My friend mostly stayed downstairs repairing the kitchen floor and knocking down old plaster walls. I was the one who ventured into the attic to organize and decide what was worth keeping. That routine continued for a couple of days without significant incident other than a persistent sense of being watched. Whenever I found myself near that armchair, it was on a late afternoon when I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. I turned around from a dusty trunk and caught what I thought was movement. It was slight, but it looked for all the world like the armchair was shifting by itself, as if someone had just stood up. The seat cushions sank and rose as though underweight. I stood, their heart pounding, a slow, icy chill washing over my skin. I told myself it must have been my imagination yet. When I approached, I could feel the cushion still gently swaying the leather, producing a subtle squeak. My breath caught in my throat and my chest felt tight, forcing me to inhale in quick, shallow gulps. I recall rushing downstairs to inform my friend of what I had seen. My voice unsteady, he shrugged it off, suggesting I was letting the spooky environment get the better of me. He offered a half smile and mentioned I might have a touch of paranoia, which only made me more uneasy. I tried to laugh it away, but my laugh came out forced and brittle. I felt foolish, yet the memory of that chair's slight movement wouldn't leave my mind. The following day, I resolved not to let my anxiety control me. I returned to the attic with a box of garbage bags and a fresh roll of duct tape, determined to finish clearing it out. The temperature felt colder than usual up there, though my skin prickled with goosebumps. Even though it was late summer and sweltering hot downstairs, the single bulb overhead flickered, casting uncertain light across the dusty boxes. I tried to ignore the trembling in my hands as I picked through old magazines and rusted tools. Eventually, my eyes shifted toward the spot beneath the window, and my heart thumped so hard it almost hurt the armchair. One stationed firmly in the corner was half a foot closer to the center of the attic. There were no scrape marks on the floorboards, no trail of disturbed dust that would indicate it had been dragged. It was as if it had simply glided or moved on its own accord. My mouth went dry and a chill sweat coated my forehead. I felt the muscles in my legs tense, ready to bolt. My mind struggled to find a rational explanation, but none came. I finished bagging the trash in silence, hyper-aware of every creak, every shift in the dusty air. I refrained from glancing at the armchair as much as possible, afraid I might see it move again when I finally left the attic. I found my friend downstairs working on repairing a wall. He asked me how it was going. I simply told him I was making progress, not wanting to revisit the conversation about my imagination still. My mind roiled with unease, and I could barely keep my heartbeat under control. Over the next few days, I avoided the attic. My tasks took me elsewhere in the house, sanding floors on the second story, recaulking a bathroom window. But every single time I passed the corridor leading to the attic stairs, I would catch the faintest squeak of leather. Shifting, sometimes it was slow and drawn out, like someone easing themselves into the seat. Other times it was abrupt, as though a weight had been lifted off suddenly. Each time my throat would close up and my pulse would race. I'd stand there in the hallway, straining to breathe, my muscles taut with dread. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or the old house settling, but the tension in my chest refused to subside. My palms would get slick with sweat and my hair would prickle at the back of my neck. The friend kept telling me I was overreacting whenever I gave the slightest hint of worry, explaining in a different tone that old houses made weird sounds. I wanted to believe him, but something in the attic defied normal explanations. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that primal warning that something was not right. One evening after we had finished our tasks for the day, I found myself drawn back to the attic. The house was silent except for the faint dripping of a faucet in the kitchen. The corridor upstairs was dark, but moonlight filtered through a cracked window. Guiding me along each step I took up the attic stairs felt heavier than the last, as if invisible hands were pushing me back down. My breathing grew fast and shallow, and my heart hammered so violently that I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. When I reached the attic, I flipped the light switch. The bulb glowed dimly. Shadows clung to every shape in the room. The air felt stagnant, like a room that had been sealed for decades. My gaze found the corner beneath the window where the armchair sat in a slightly different angle again. The cushion bore a vague impression on one side, as though occupied moments before a knot formed in my stomach, and my body felt seized by an intense dread. My legs trembled as I approached it. I could hear the faint squeak of the leather again, as if it were still settling, the odor of old cracked leather mingled with a musty stench that seemed new. Pungent, almost like damp soil. My skin crawled. I was convinced someone or something was there, just invisible to the eye. I lifted a trembling hand and hovered it above the seat cushion. The surface felt cold, unnaturally cold, and my fingers instinctively recoiled. I decided then that I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if something beyond understanding was truly happening. So I did what logic dictated. I pushed the armchair against the wall, feeling the friction of the wooden legs against the floor. I made sure it was firmly wedged so it couldn't be shifted easily. Breathing heavily, I took a mental snapshot of its exact position down to where the shadows fell around it. My plan was to come back in an hour or two and see if it had moved. I headed downstairs, my heart still racing, and tried to occupy myself in the living room by measuring windows for new drapes. Each passing minute felt slower than the last, and my nerves were on edge. I noticed my hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the measuring tape. Eventually, I forced myself to return to the attic, counting each step in an attempt to steady my breathing at the top of the stairs. I paused, bracing for what I might see. My body felt tense, my palms sweaty, and my pulse thrummed in my ears. The overhead bulb flickered once, then stabilized. My gaze shot to the spot beneath the window, only to find the armchair positioned a few feet away from where I had left it. The top edge was angled toward the attic door, almost as if it were staring at me. A wave of nausea rolled over me, and I felt faint. My knees nearly gave out, and I clutched the doorframe for support. I wanted to run, but some mixture of disbelief and grim curiosity kept me rooted there. My breathing ragged and my mind spinning with questions, I reached out with trembling hands, steadying myself against a box for support. My vision blurred for a moment with panic, my thoughts swirling about the possibility of something malevolent inhabiting this space. I rubbed my eyes, trying to keep my sanity intact. It was so quiet that the smallest sound or rustle, a faint groan of wood, echoed in that cramped attic like a scream from that night on the sense of being watched intensified whenever I set foot on the second floor. Even mundane tasks like retrieving a toolbox or spackling a hallway crack became a gauntlet of sweaty palms and a racing heart. I would glance over my shoulder every few seconds, certain I'd glimpse a shape in my peripheral vision. The corridors felt narrower, the walls pressing in as though the house was determined to keep me on edge, and that squeaking continued, sometimes faint and intermittent, sometimes sharp and urgent, as though the occupant of that chair wanted me to know it was there. One afternoon, I heard what sounded like measured steps above me, pacing back and forth. Then came a distinct scraping of wood, followed by the unmistakable groan of leather. My hair stood on end, and a surge of fear poured ice into my veins. I sprinted outside into the weak daylight, gulping down fresh air and willing my pulse to slow. I didn't return until dusk forced me to gather my belongings. Even then, I avoided the attic entirely eventually. My friend asked if I wanted to keep helping with the renovations or if I needed a break. He hadn't heard the peculiar noises himself, or so he claimed. He said in a calm but dismissive tone that maybe the stress of physical labor and the darkness of the attic were getting to me. Part of me believed it might be true. I started to wonder if I was unraveling, seeing illusions conjured by my own paranoia. But every time I walked past that corridor, the squeak of the armchair would reach my ears, quickening my heartbeat and sending cold beads of sweat trickling down my back. The final straw came on an evening when I was alone in the house, finishing some last-minute tasks. While my friend ran errands, I was on the second floor when I heard a series of noises from above, an intense groaning of leather, then what sounded like a hard thump. My chest clenched. I approached the attic stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the threshold, I flicked on the light to see the chair. This time it was dead center in the attic, angled to face me directly. The seat was indented as if supporting a heavy weight. but there was nothing visible. Occupying that space, a low dragging sound seemed to emanate from the chair itself, like the leather was breathing. I stood there, heart pounding, sweat dampening my brow. My throat too tight to call out the air felt electric, charged with something hostile. A wave of dizziness made me sway. My entire body screamed at me to leave. I took a step back and the overhead bulb popped. Plunging the attic into darkness, the shadows swallowed everything, and I heard movement, scraping, squeaking, something shifting in the pitch black. My breath came in, desperate gasps as I fumbled for the flashlight on my phone. The narrow beam caught a glimpse of the empty seat cushion. Rising back into shape like something had just stood up, I didn't wait to find out more. My heart hammered so fiercely that I worried it would burst. I nearly stumbled down the stairs, racing out of the house as my pulse roared in my ears. Outside, I gulped fresh air and gripped the railing, trying to steady. My trembling limbs, even the waning daylight, felt like a floodlight. Compared to that oppressive darkness in the attic, I sat on the porch steps, chest heaving, until my friend returned. I couldn't articulate to him exactly what had happened. Only I refused to set foot in that attic again. Days later, I packed my things and left. My friend didn't argue or insist I stay. He just gave me a certain look that suggested he might have started to believe something was wrong in that house, even if he didn't admit it openly. As I drove away, the tension in my chest began to ease, but I couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that the house was still watching me, that the unseen occupant of that threadbare armchair now knew my scent and my fear. Even now, I still dream of that attic in my nightmares. I find myself climbing those stairs, the bulb flickering overhead. The chair is there, always waiting. Sometimes in the dream, I see an imprint on the cushion that expands and contracts like something breathing other times. I glimpse the outline of a shape reflected in the attic window, a distorted silhouette that stands behind the chair. I wake up with my heart in my throat, covered in cold sweat. Unable to shake the memory, I can't say with absolute certainty what haunted that house. Perhaps it was some residual echo of a past tenant, or maybe it was the house's own malevolent presence. What I do know is this: I will never forget the sensation of leather shifting under an invisible weight, or the oppressive cold that clung to every inch of that attic. Sometimes late at night, I swear I can still hear the faint squeak of old leather moving in a distant room, a reminder that some doors once opened never quite close. And whenever that memory surfaces, my pulse races, my skin prickles, and I feel that same dread pressing like invisible hands on my chest, whispering that certain secrets are better left undisturbed. The kettle started whistling again yesterday, echoing through my apartment like a grim announcement. I can still feel the tremor it sent through me, the skin on the back of my neck prickling as though a cold hand had grazed it. If I concentrate, I can almost hear that shrill note lingering in the corridors of my mind, refusing to let me forget how unreal it all felt, how impossible it should have been. I live alone in a relatively modern apartment building, the kind of place you assume room has no secrets. The walls are freshly painted, the floors hardly squeak, and the windows seal out the city noise almost too efficiently when I first moved in. I thought I had discovered a corner of urban paradise: clean hallways, reliable elevators, and friendly neighbors who never pried into my business. It was exactly what I needed. I felt relieved that I could come home each day, lock the door behind me, and never worry about intrusions or unwelcome surprises. That feeling dissolved the first time I heard the kettle whistle. I work at a small design firm downtown, so I often return home late in the evening by the time I make it back. The building is eerily quiet, the day it all began. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The sun had already set, and the hallway lights hummed with that faint electrical buzz. You only notice when you're alone. My apartment looked just as I had left it. Shoes by the door blinds half closed, a few dishes drying on the rack. I distinct lie remember placing my electric kettle on the kitchen countertop before heading to the bathroom. It was the usual routine. I was tired, sweaty from the commute, so a quick shower sounded. Perfect. The kettle was unplugged. No water was inside. I never gave it a second thought. Within minutes of turning on the shower, I heard a high-pitched whistle that set my heart hammering. At first, I tried to reassure myself that it must be an alarm in someone else's unit. I even paused the water to listen more carefully. The whistle was unmistakable, cutting through the hush of the tiled bathroom as though I stood right next to it. Every hair on my arm stood up. Confusion turned to dread. When I realized it sounded precisely like the kettle's piercing note of boiling water. My pulse was pounding so loudly that my breath caught in my throat. I jumped out of the shower, barely drying myself as I raced to the kitchen. I fully expected steam, sizzling water, or something else that might justify the noise. Instead, I found the kitchen lights flickering faintly, the kettle cold and untouched on the countertop. No water dripped from it, no heat radiated off its metallic surface. The plug still lay limp beside it. My heart thrummed against my ribs, and I stood there in a damp towel for what felt like ages, scanning every corner of the room. I remember thinking, perhaps I'm just that tired. Maybe the day stress had gotten to me that night I barely slept. Each time I closed my eyes, I replayed the sequence of events: arriving home, placing the kettle on the counter, hearing the whistle, and finding it inert. Over and over my mind churned with possibilities. Could it have been a trick of the plumbing? Was it the wind whistling through a poorly sealed window? These excuses felt feeble, but I needed something to hang on to. My body hummed with anxiety sweat, beating on my forehead every time a faint noise stirred me from half-sleep. A few days later, it happened again, this time. I came home in the late afternoon, just early enough to catch some pale sunshine leaking through the balcony doors. My plan was to make a quick snack, so I put a mug on the counter and ready to teabag, but I realized I was out of fresh milk. Annoyed, I decided to go to the convenience store down the street once again. I left the kettle sitting on the countertop unplugged while I waited in line at the store. I felt an odd twinge of unease, but I tried to brush it off. I told myself everything was normal. When I stepped back into my apartment, I heard the high-pitched whistle dull but instantly recognizable, as though it were emanating from just around the corner. My heart lurched, my breath stuttered in my chest. This time I sprinted to the kitchen. The kettle was exactly where I had left it. The handle was cool to the touch, the metal body reflecting my alarmed face in a warped, unkind distortion. My stomach knotted and a clammy sweat prickled under my arms. I recall checking every appliance that evening, pressing my ear to the walls, even stepping out into the hallway to see if someone else was boiling water. Everything was silent. Returning to my unit felt like stepping back into a bubble of tension. The overhead light seemed too dim, casting elongated shadows across every eye object. My own footsteps on the hardwood made me flinch. I remember swallowing hard, my mouth parched as if I had forgotten to drink water all day. I paced around the apartment for a while, convincing myself that something else must be at fault. Over the following week, I became hypervigilant. I made a habit of examining every inch of the kitchen. Each time I returned home, the kettle, once an unremarkable fixture in my daily routine, now held an aura of, for it wasn't just whistling anymore. Some mornings I noticed it had shifted position once the handle faced the stove instead of the living room. Another time I found it angled toward the sink, as though someone had used it and set it down hastily. My heartbeat would spike whenever I saw it out of place. I tried to recall if I'd moved it myself, a half-asleep habit maybe, but the recollection never came when I talked to the building manager about strange noises. I didn't mention the kettle. Instead, I casually asked if the walls were thin or if any maintenance workers had accidentally entered my apartment. The manager told me no one else had keys and no work orders were scheduled for my unit. I felt the color drain from my face as I nodded politely, swallowing a bitter lump of tension in my throat. The nights became unbearable. Each small sound made me jolt awake. My mind began crafting scenarios of intruders flipping through the door the moment I turned my back, but there was never any sign of forced entry. My possessions remained intact except for the kettle's inexplicable movements. I even changed the locks out of paranoia, paying extra to have someone come in and install a brand new set. For a time, I left the kettle in a cabinet out of sight. I wondered if ignoring it might help me reclaim some peace of mind. That strategy failed. One evening, I returned from work to see the cabinet door slightly ajar. The kettle was back on the counter, angled in that same unsettling way. My hands shook when I picked it up. I felt a cold sensation spreading through my chest like a block of ice forming around my heart. The air felt thinner, my lungs struggling to draw oxygen. I leaned against the sink, my knees weak trying to keep calm. I asked myself if I was losing my grip on reality. Had I absent-mindedly retrieved the kettle, but I couldn't remember doing so. My body was slick with a cold sweat, and a tremor coursed through my arms as I placed it back in the cabinet and locked every door in the apartment. That night, things escalated sometimes in the dead of night. I would wake to that shrill whistle reverberating through the silence. It was so vivid that my pulse would skyrocket, my breath catching in my lungs. Yet when I rushed to the kitchen, the kettle lay dormant, mocking my fear with its silence. It felt as though something was playing with me. Delighting in my terror, the entire apartment began to feel like a labyrinth of flickering shadows. Light bulbs would dim for no reason, then surge back to full brightness. I'd catch glimpses of movement in reflective surfaces only to spin around and see nothing there. On one especially harrowing night, I was certain I heard a scraping noise like the kettle being dragged across the countertop. My mouth went dry and beads of sweat formed along my hairline. I forced myself out of bed, heart pounding so fiercely I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. In the dark hallway, I strained to listen. A faint click sounded. Metal meeting. Metal. My hand shook as I fumbled for the light switch when the overhead bulb flickered on the kettle. Sat at the edge of the counter handle, pointed toward me as if inviting me to pick it up. I stood. Frozen, the only sound my own ragged breathing, it felt as though the apartment itself were alive, waiting. I began questioning my sanity more openly. I even confided in a colleague at work. Though I avoided giving too many details, he suggested I might be overworked or experiencing stress-induced hallucinations. He recommended a short vacation or therapy, saying something about how the mind can play tricks when you're exhausted. I nodded along, but deep down I couldn't accept that these experiences were purely psychological. The physical evidence was too clear in a desperate attempt to reclaim control. I started setting up small traps. I placed flour around the kettle before going to bed, hoping to find footprints or marks that would prove someone or something was messing with it. But each morning the flour remained undisturbed, except for the kettle itself. Being at an odd angle, or sometimes not even on the flour at all, it was as though it had moved without touching the ground. My anxiety spiral, I developed a habit of looking over my shoulder, expecting to see a figure in the periphery of my vision. The shadows in the corners of the living room felt heavy, almost sentient. Occasionally, I thought I sensed a presence behind me, that unmistakable prickle along the spine that screams, "You are not alone." Nightmares plagued me. I would see the kettle floating mid-air, whistling louder and louder until its sound became a piercing shriek, jolting me awake in a sweat-soaked panic. Finally, I decided I couldn't endure it any longer. One night, after hearing that dreaded whistle for the third time in a single evening, I grabbed my coat and marched to the door, determined to flee. But as I reached for the doorknob, a scraping noise came from the kitchen, a slow, deliberate scrape of metal on the countertop. My heart pounded like a war drum. Each exhalation felt shallow. My breath trembled in my throat, and my vision seemed to narrow, as if the apartment itself were tightening around me. I forced myself to return to the kitchen. The kettle hovered dangerously close to the edge, handle tilted so precariously that a single nudge would send it crashing to the floor. Its polished metal glimmered in the dim overhead light, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw a reflection that wasn't entirely my own. It looked like a shape behind me, vague, looming, impossible to describe. My spine tingled and a cold flush coursed through my veins. I didn't wait to investigate. I snatched the kettle, feeling its cold surface under my clammy palms, and stuffed it into a cardboard box. I had lying around then with trembling hands. I taped the box shut as if trying to lock away a demon. My breath came in quick bursts as I hauled the box into the coat closet. I shut the closet door, my ears ringing with the silence that followed. My heart hammered in my chest, adrenaline surging through every muscle with the kettle locked away. I left the apartment, spent the night in a cheap hotel, and slept a few hours for the first time in weeks. The next morning, I wrestled with myself about going home. A heavy, indescribable dread settled over me as I reached my front door, but I realized I had to confront whatever was happening when I finally unlocked it and stepped inside. The apartment was still the closet door remained firmly shut. The only sound was my ragged breathing and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Tentatively, I opened the closet. The box sat untouched for a moment. I felt an almost dizzying relief. Perhaps it was all in my head. Perhaps I'd contained whatever bizarre energy seemed attached to the kettle. Then as I reached for the box to see if the tape was still secure, I heard it the faintest whistle. Not loud or shrill this time, but a low, ghostly note that rose from somewhere deep in the apartment walls. My blood ran cold. A shiver shook my entire body. I backed away from the closet, swallowing hard. At that moment, I understood with a dreadful certainty that no change of locks or sealed boxes would fix this. There was something in that apartment, something that defied reason with sweat seeping into the collar of my shirt. I tried to steady my breathing, each inhale a laborious effort as I stood there paralyzed. The whistle rose again like a spectral PA beckoning me deeper into the apartment's secrets, and I knew in that heart-stopping instant that no matter how many times I moved the kettle or how far I fled, I could never escape the eerie presence that had claimed a home in the place I'd once thought was my sanctuary. I still live there, though my nights are fraught with apprehension. I can't bring myself to move out. Something beyond fear compels me to stay as if I must solve this puzzle, so every now and then I hear that whistle in the dead of night searing through my nerves, reminding me that even the most ordinary objects can become gateways to terror if they choose. And every time it happens, I feel the same cold knot tighten in my chest, the same doubt gnawing at my sanity until I wonder whether I'll ever find peace. Behind these modern, unblemished walls, I remember the first night it happened as if it were etched into my mind with a razor. The city below was silent in a way that only big cities can be after everyone goes to sleep, an unsettling hush that feels unnatural. Even from the moment I stepped onto my narrow balcony, I sensed something in the air, some unfriendly current that coiled around my neck and pulled me forward, making my pulse pound in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a shift in the wind or the hum of faraway traffic, but deep down I knew something was off. Something that made my skin crawl, and then the whispers began. I had decided to move to this new apartment shortly after switching jobs. I was tired of commuting from the outskirts of town, so the prospect of living downtown felt both exciting and convenient. The building itself was modern, with a tall lobby and glass walls that reflected every car light passing by my unit was on one of the higher floors, and it had this unbelievably narrow balcony that provided a view of another tower across the street. By view, I mean you could practically see into your neighbor's living room if they kept the curtains open, but there wasn't much else to see. Besides the lines of windows stacked across from me, I tried to decorate my place to make it feel like home. A few framed posters on the walls, warm lamps in the living room, a modest but cozy couch, and a small table out on the balcony for an evening coffee or a late night read. The first couple of days were uneventful. I was settling into my new routine, exploring the nearby streets and adjusting to the city noise. Yet as soon as I started to grow comfortable, odd things began to creep into my awareness. It started in small ways, the sense that the door to my balcony was slightly ajar when I was certain I had locked it, or the sudden flicker of the overhead light in the hallway when I passed under it. Even though there was no reason for an electrical issue, occasionally I noticed how the air on my balcony felt colder than in the living room, even though I had left the door wide open to let in the evening breeze. I kept telling myself it was all perfectly normal. Urban living comes with quirky building noises, and old wiring can cause flickers. Rationalizing these experiences felt easier than confronting the discomfort that gnawed at my mind. But then the whispers started. The first time I heard them, it was close to 11 at night, I remember, because I had just finished a call with a friend who was asking how I liked my new place. I stepped out onto the balcony with a mug of coffee in hand, hoping to wind down the moment I took my first sip. I heard a faint hiss that sounded almost like wind swirling through a narrow gap. I froze, breath catching in my throat, waiting to see if it was just a gust. The sound continued, layered and soft, like multiple voices speaking in hushed tones. My heart hammered against my ribcage. I spun around expecting to see someone behind me, maybe a neighbor leaning over their own railing, but all I found was empty air. The opposite tower was quiet. Most units were dark. My mouth went dry and I felt a trickle of sweat slide down my spine. I tried to ignore the sensation that invisible eyes were watching me. Eventually, I backed into my living room, closed the balcony door, and forced myself to watch television until I was too tired to think about it. Still, the remnants of those voices clung to me. The next few nights, the pattern repeated always around the same time, somewhere between 10:30 and 11. I would notice a slight disturbance, like a change in the air pressure. The minute I stepped out to investigate, I'd hear them again. Tiny, breathy murmurs that seemed to be right behind my ear, but without any physical presence to explain them. Some nights I swore I could pick up fragments of words. It was never enough to form a coherent sentence, but they were definitely syllables of something like a voice trying to call me, lure me, or maybe even warn me. I remember one night at around 11:30, the whispers were so insistent that I felt compelled to lean over the balcony railing and look down. My entire body tensed as I scanned the street below. There was no one there. Just the deserted sidewalk dimly lit by the streetlights. The sensation of a presence beside me was overwhelming. So much so that I jolted when a car horn sounded a few blocks away. I scrambled back inside, flicked on every light in my apartment, and locked all my windows. The whispers had stopped as soon as I turned on the lights, leaving me with nothing but the hum of my own fear. My days at the office became difficult. I would show up drained and anxious, constantly replaying the events in my mind. My boss noticed I looked exhausted and asked if everything was all right, but I just mumbled that I was having trouble sleeping in. Truth, it wasn't the lack of sleep itself, it was the creeping anxiety that maybe I was losing my grip. I started second-guessing my recollection of the whispers. Could it be the wind bouncing off the buildings? Could I have read too many creepy stories on the internet? Yet every night the same thing happened, the same whispers at the same time, beckoning me to pay attention. Eventually I confided in a coworker about the strange sounds. Not directly, but in a roundabout way, I described hearing odd noises on my balcony. He offered a logical explanation. Perhaps the shape of the buildings created a wind tunnel that made weird echoes on a separate occasion. A neighbor mentioned having heard gusty howls between the tea hours, but never anything like whispered voices. I found a small slice of comfort in the possibility that this might be a bizarre acoustic phenomenon rather than something supernatural, but that comfort never lasted past 10:30 at night. The real turning point happened about 2 weeks after moving in. By then, my nerves were frayed, sleep was elusive, and my appetite had dwindled to almost nothing. My evenings were a mess of dread and anticipation, waiting for the whispers to start. But one particular night, it was different. The city was unbelievably quiet. The hush felt like it was smothering every corner of my apartment when the clock hit 11 p.m. I stepped onto the balcony with shaky legs, determined to face whatever was out there. I wanted to prove to myself it was just wind or my imagination. The moment I rested my hand on the balcony's metal railing, an icy chill clamped around my wrist. It wasn't the cool night air. It felt like a hand and an actual grip, but I couldn't see anything. My breath hitched and my heart rate soared. Fear pulsed through me, making my fingers go numb. I tried to yank my arm away, but the sensation remained. It was as though the emptiness beside me had become solid for a fraction of a second, solid enough to hold me. Then I heard the whispers directly in my ear, a murmuring swirl that grew louder and more distinct than ever before, though I still couldn't decipher every word. One phrase emerged, a single word repeated in a whispered chain. Come, it was less of a demand and more of a coaxing suggestion, as if I were being invited or pulled toward something. I wrenched myself free from that invisible grip and stumbled back into my living room, slamming the door behind me. My entire body was shaking. My lungs felt as though they had shrunk to half their size. Each breath painfully shallow, the sweat on my brow turned cold and my stomach lurched. I found myself teetering between panic and disbelief. The logical part of me wanted to insist it wasn't real, but my racing heart and trembling limbs told me otherwise. For the next few days, I avoided the balcony entirely. I even drew the curtains blocking my view of the other tower because seeing it made me feel nauseated. Still, the sense of being watched persisted. At random moments during the day, I felt a prickling sensation along the back of my neck, as though someone or something was observing me. My dreams when I managed to sleep were frantic nightmares of dark silhouettes hovering at the edge of my vision, whispering my name in raspy voices that cut through my mind like static. My growing paranoia led me to inspect every inch of my apartment. I checked for hidden vents, unusual gaps in the walls, or anything that might produce those eerie sounds. I found nothing that could explain it. The building's concierge claimed there had been no maintenance complaints or reports of strange noises. I felt trapped in my own fear, convinced that if I opened up to anyone about the full extent of what I was experiencing, they would question my sanity. Finally, I reached a breaking point on a Friday night just before 11 p.m. I made a decision I would confront whatever was on that balcony, whatever was trying to invade my mind. I turned off all the lights in the apartment. The only illumination came from the glow of city lights. Through the closed curtains, my heart was pounding so intensely that my chest felt like it might burst. My throat was tight saliva, almost impossible to swallow with trembling hands. I slid the curtain aside and opened the balcony door. The air was still. The city below was silent except for the distant hum of traffic. I took one step out. The tiles were cold under my feet. Another step. Then I paused, forcing myself to breathe to keep my wits about me, and that was when I heard it again. Soft whispers flowing like a river of sound around me, forming incomplete words that brushed my ears. I stood there, refusing to back down. Suddenly, I felt that same gripping chill on my arm. This time, it tightened around my elbow, urging me forward. My heart thudded so loudly that I could barely hear my own thoughts. But I fought the instinct to run. I stayed still, determined to see if there was anything visible. Then out of the corner of my eye, I caught a faint distortion in the air like a ripple of heat. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm that I wasn't alone. On that balcony, a low-pressing dizziness overcame me, and I wavered on my feet. In that moment, my mind flooded with a single, overwhelming realization whatever was there wanted me to step beyond the railing. The intention behind that grip, the coiling presence, was to guide me closer to the edge. The panic was indescribable. My entire body was trembling. My head spun and my lungs fought for air. I could almost sense my own consciousness slipping away, as though the whispers were winding their way into my brain, erasing every sense of self-preservation with a final burst of adrenaline. I tore myself free and stumbled back into the apartment, slamming the door shut so hard it rattled in its frame. My vision blurred and I doubled over, gasping for breath, sweat coursing down my temples. I felt the impossible urge to open the door again, as if a compulsion were building inside me. My hand trembled on the doorknob for a few agonizing seconds until I mustered every ounce of willpower to let go and step away. That night I barely slept. I sat in the corner of my bedroom watching the balcony door through the open bedroom door, waiting to see if it would creep open on its own. It never did. By the time the morning light crept through the window, I had made a choice. I wasn't going to stay no job. No convenience of living downtown could justify remaining in this place where something intangible but undeniably malevolent lingered. I contacted a realtor at the first reasonable hour, explained that I needed to move quickly, and made arrangements. Packing up was a whirlwind, but I couldn't leave fast enough. I never told anyone the full story, only that the apartment wasn't a good fit. My boss was surprised, but didn't question me much within a week. I had found a temporary place on the outskirts again. The rent was higher, the commute was longer, but the relief was immediate from my new mod balcony. I looked out at a quiet tree-lined street at night. All I heard were the occasional chirps of insects and the soft rustling of leaves. Yet even with that calm settling around me, I couldn't shake the lingering doubt. What if the whispers had followed me? What if they knew where I was? Sometimes late at night, I can't help but recall that final moment of nearly losing myself to that silent invitation. I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear them faintly in the distance. My heart bangs in my chest, and I'm seized by the terror that if I listen too closely, I might make out those fragments of speech again. Even now, I can't fully explain what happened, nor can I dismiss it as a mere hallucination, but I do know that the memory of those whispering voices and that icy touch on my skin will never leave me. It's a part of me, a shadow lurking just beyond the edge of reason, waiting for the perfect moment to coil itself around my senses once more. I still remember the first night I truly believed my surroundings had turned against me. The soft hum of the city outside did little to disguise the unnatural stillness that clung to my new apartment instead of comfort. The silence brought unease. It was the kind of quiet that allows every breath, every rustle of fabric and every faint scrape in the walls to seize full control of your senses. There in the darkness of my bedroom, an ordinary curtain moved in a way that defied explanation, and that single detail shattered my confidence in the logical world. I thought I knew I am not the kind of person who believes in haunting stories or unexplainable phenomena. I have always been the practical type, the one who checks the fuse box before assuming a poltergeist is flickering the lights, or who tests for drafts before proclaiming a ghost is breathing on my neck. But this new apartment challenged everything. I thought I understood nothing made sense from the very beginning, starting with the strangest quirk of all, the bedroom curtain that insisted on swaying when there was no visible source of air. I inspected the window frame, the vents, the air conditioner, even the seams of the ceiling. Yet every night without fail, that heavy fabric would shift, flutter, and sometimes even billow inward as if something were passing through it. The first time I noticed the movement, I was lying awake unable to sleep because the city light seemed somehow too bright, and the darkness inside the apartment felt far too deep. My eyes were drawn to the curtains, gently rippling as though teased by a breeze. I remember sitting up feeling the sudden rush of cold down my arms, my skin prickling with goosebumps. Even my breath momentarily caught in my throat. I thought I must have left a window cracked open, or perhaps there was a hidden draft. But the window was locked tight. I placed my hand on the glass. It was as still and cold as the night itself. No wind, no vent blowing air, no logical explanation. It started small. The curtain would move when I wasn't looking directly at it. Just a glimpse from the corner of my eye, a slight quiver, maybe a subtle shift in the folds. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination. After all, the mind plays tricks in an unfamiliar home, and sometimes stress and lack of sleep can conjure illusions. But the phenomenon quickly escalated. On a few occasions, I even felt a gentle push of air against my face as I approached the window, a faint but unmistakable whisper of coolness that set my nerves on edge. I couldn't replicate it under normal observation. If I stood there waiting, nothing would happen, but if I turned away or got distracted, I would catch that flutter in my peripheral vision or sense the stirring of air out of sheer frustration. I pinned the curtain to the wall one evening using thumbtacks and heavy tape to prevent it from moving. This was my attempt at reclaiming a sense of normalcy. Yet by midnight, I heard the faint rasp of fabric being pulled free when I switched on the light. The curtain hung loose again, swaying gently. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I could feel the dryness in my mouth as adrenaline spiked. Suddenly, my once cozy bedroom felt more like an alien environment that refused to conform to logic. I tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps the adhesive of the tape was weak, or maybe I hadn't pressed the tacks in firmly, but deep down I couldn't ignore the dreadful certainty that something else was responsible. My nerves were fraying. Simple tasks became battles against an ever-present sense of being watched. Whenever I entered the bedroom, I felt an electric tension in the air, as though the room itself were holding its breath late at night. I would lie awake in the living room instead, telling myself I was just more comfortable on the couch. But the truth was that I couldn't bear to watch that curtain shift on its own. It was more than just the movement. It was the feeling that something stood behind it, waiting, perhaps observing me in the darkness. The faintest sound of the fabric scraping against the windowsill would jolt me into a state of raw anxiety. My heart would pound so forcefully that I could hear my own pulse, and I would catch myself trembling. My skin slick with a cold sweat in an attempt to dispel my paranoia. I invited a friend over to have a look, though I kept my explanations vague. I said I needed a second opinion on whether the place had some hidden draft issues. He walked around the room, checked the windows and vents, and eventually shrugged. He thought it was likely some structural quirk. He didn't see the curtain move, and I didn't bring up my deeper fears because I knew how absurd they would sound after he left. I felt worse, the fleeting sense of safety that comes from having another person present dissolved, and the apartment felt more oppressive than ever before. I started hearing sounds at night, soft creaks in the floorboards, even though the building was relatively new, and faint tapping noise from the bedroom walls. At times, I swear the tapping matched the rhythm of my own racing heartbeat as if it were mocking my fear. Shadows seemed to stretch across the living room floor with a mind of their own, especially when the moon was bright and the wind outside was still the light that spilled in from the street. Light seemed inadequate, as if it couldn't quite pierce the darkness that had taken residence in the corners of the apartment. Even my reflection in the windows unsettled me. Once, while pacing in the living room, I glanced at my mirrored silhouette in the glass, only to notice a slight distortion. A ripple behind me near the hall that led to the bedroom. The moment I turned, there was nothing there. I spent more and more nights out of the bedroom, preferring the lumpy couch that left my back aching in the morning to the suffocating atmosphere behind that closed bedroom door. My insomnia worsened. Every evening felt like an exercise in anticipatory dread. My nights blurred into days, and I started questioning my sanity. Could sheer anxiety manifest such potent hallucinations? I would wake up on the couch with my heart pounding, convinced I'd heard the curtain flap, only to realize that the entire apartment was deadly silent, and that silence carried a weight of expectation, as though something waited for me to surrender and walk back into that bedroom one particularly harrowing night. I decided to confront whatever was happening. My plan was simple: stay awake in the bedroom until I either caught the curtain moving in real time or convinced myself it was all in my head. I placed a chair in the corner of the room opposite the window and sat there with my phone's flashlight and a notepad to jot down any observations. At first, nothing happened. The curtain hung lifelessly, and I began to think I was indeed losing my grip, that maybe I had just overreacted. But as the minutes turned into hours, my fatigue set and my eyes drooped, and I struggled to keep them open. Then, in that lial state between wakefulness and sleep, I felt a sudden burst of cold air brush across my cheek. My eyes snapped open, and in the faint glow from the street lamp outside, I saw the curtain shift as if an invisible hand had just passed along its length, every hair on my body. Rose. My breath caught in my throat. The curtain didn't just move. It parted slightly, revealing a glimpse of the moonlit window beneath, but the window was locked, the glass reflecting my terrified expression. The parting of the fabric was delicate, almost polite, as if something were stepping through a doorway. In that moment, my body screamed for me to run, every muscle tensing, a cold sweat beating on my forehead. I shone my phone's flashlight at the window, hoping it would illuminate nothing but the pale wall behind the curtain instead. For the briefest second, I saw a distortion, a flicker like heat haze just behind the fabric. My heart hammered so violently that I thought I would black out. I stumbled out of the chair, nearly dropping my phone, and hurried into the living room. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I realized I was shaking uncontrollably. I felt cornered. If I ran outside, I'd be fleeing my own home. But staying inside felt like inviting whatever was behind the curtain to consume me whole, if it could even do something so concrete. I questioned whether I was having a full-blown panic attack. The rational part of my mind told me there was no such thing as a sentient curtain or an entity that chooses windows as a gateway, but I couldn't erase the memory of that whisper of cold air on my face or the graceful way the curtain had moved apart. I decided in a blind panic that I couldn't stay there anymore. The next morning, the light of day did little to comfort me, but it gave me the courage to pack a few essentials. The landlord had insisted on a 6-month lease minimum, but at that point I was more than willing to forfeit my deposit if it meant regaining peace of mind as I shoved clothes into a suitcase. I kept an eye on the bedroom door, half expecting to see that thick fabric stirring in broad daylight, but the curtain remained still, its quiet presence looming like a silent sentinel. By the time I had gathered enough belongings to stay at a hotel, my skin was coated in a sheen of sweat, and my mouth felt parched from shallow, rapid breathing. I paused in the living room, staring at the hallway that led back to the bedroom. My body vibrated with tension. A part of me wanted to fling the curtain open, tear it down, and prove once and for all that there was nothing there but a gnawing voice in my head, warned that confronting it again might unleash something I wasn't prepared to face. Instead, I simply walked out of the apartment, locking the door behind me with shaking hands. Even in the well-lit corridor, my paranoia persisted. I felt as though invisible eyes followed me until the elevator door slid shut. That same evening, I checked into a small hotel a few blocks away. The room was cramped and the noise from the other guests irritated me, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a semblance of safety. It was a tired, worn-out security, but it was something my mind drifted over the events in the apartment. Was I truly escaping a supernatural force, or was I running from my own deteriorating mental state? The question haunted me through the night. Eventually, I gave into exhaustion and slept, though my dreams were filled with images of that shifting curtain and a silent presence waiting just beyond it. Now, as I write these final thoughts, I realize I'm still plagued by doubt and an unshakable sense of dread. I can't entirely blame the apartment. It may be nothing more than an unfortunate series of coincidences amplified by my anxiety. Or perhaps it really is the site of something inexplicable, something that defies rational explanation. Either way, my memories cling to me like a second skin, and I doubt I'll ever stand in front of a closed curtain at night without feeling that tiny, paralyzing spark of fear. I haven't returned to the apartment. For all I know, the curtain remains exactly as I left it. Silently watching and waiting, and that idea, more than anything else, leaves me with a persistent knot in my stomach. There are no easy answers and no simple escape from the dread that has lodged itself in my mind. I can only hope that distance and time will dull the terror. But deep down, I suspect that when night falls and the world goes quiet, I will always imagine that curtain stirring, inviting me to peer behind it, and whatever stands or drifts on the other side. I remember the first night I heard it, a dull, repetitive tap echoing through the metal walls of my newly acquired warehouse. It was so faint at first that I assumed it was just the building settling, or maybe a branch scraping along the exterior, but the hush of that cavernous interior with its stacked crates and flickering fluorescent lights made every little noise feel amplified like a whispered secret. In a silent chamber, my skin prickled beneath the overhead lamps, and I felt an inexplicable tension coil in my stomach, as though an unseen observer stood just beyond my line of sight. Even then, I recognized that something was off, something that made the space feel more like a tomb than a warehouse. I had acquired the property for an irresistible price, wanting a dedicated place to store the expanding inventory for my small business. The location was decent on the edge of an industrial zone with no immediate neighbors, meaning I could come and go at all hours without disturbing anyone. In the first week, everything felt ordinary, just a large rectangular structure. High ceilings and an echo that reminded me of standing alone in a cathedral, but that echo turned oppressive when I began hearing the tapping. Late at night, I tried to convince myself that it was a quirk of an old building. Perhaps pipes were contracting in the cool air, or some rusted ventilation shaft was rattling in the breeze, but as the weeks wore on, I realized I could not explain it away so easily. The taps came in sets, 3, sometimes 4, and would repeat at irregular intervals. They seemed to come from the back wall, an area with no adjoining structures or visible pipes. Often I would check the time, half convinced I was imagining it, only to hear it again. Minutes later, my heart would pound and a trickle of sweat would run down my back. Despite the chill of the cavernous space, the sense of being watched, of not being alone, became nearly unbearable early on. I tried telling myself I was just exhausted from long work days. I would briefly mention to a friend that the warehouse had odd acoustics, but I avoided sounding alarmist in response. I received casual suggestions that it was just old tin siding, or that I might be hearing small animals skittering around. Yet deep down, I felt it was more the final straw came. One evening, when I decided to stay extra late to organize shipments for the following week. That night, I heard the distinct pattern again, light fists knocking 4 times in a deliberate rhythm. I froze the hairs on my arms. Rising as a chill spread across my skin, I stood near a tall rack of boxes trying to listen over the hum of the fluorescent lights. The knocks came again louder. My stomach lurched and my breath hitched in my throat. I forced myself to gather my courage and investigate, flashlight in hand. I walked outside the beam, cutting through the darkness of the empty lot. The soil was dry and bare. No footprints. Nothing that could have caused the tapping. I circled the perimeter, pressing my hand against the corrugated metal to see if I felt it. Any vibration, the surface was cold. Nothing seemed out of place. No figures lurking. No broken branches banging against the siding. It was just emptiness, a patch of silent night under a hazy moon. The tension in my chest eased momentarily as I convinced myself I had probably overreacted. But the moment I stepped back inside and clicked the door shut behind me, I heard the tapping once more. This time it was closer, as if it had moved a few yards forward. Hugging the wall from within, my throat went dry and I felt my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. I stood there, aiming my flashlight at the interior wall, half expecting something to burst through. I remember my hand trembling so badly that the beam shook, casting quivering shadows across the stacked boxes. I approached the wall with slow, careful steps, each footstep echoing in the emptiness of the warehouse. Unable to contain my impulse, I raised my hand and knocked back 3 sharp raps in response. The warehouse fell silent. My ears, straining against the quiet time, seemed to stretch my pulse, thawing in my ears. Then after a few agonizing moments, 3 dull knocks echoed back. I stumbled backward, practically dropping the flashlight in my panic. A cold flush of dread flooded my veins, and I found myself blinking rapidly as though trying to awake from a nightmare. Except I was wide awake, and the presence behind that wall, whatever it was, seemed very real from that night. On my sense of normally eroded each evening, I stayed late. The tapping would return some nights. It was faint, a distant knocking I could almost ignore if I kept busy with my tasks. Other nights, it seemed to come from multiple points along the wall, circling me, challenging me to investigate. I started to dread locking up alone. My hands would shake as I tried to focus on loading boxes or updating inventory spreadsheets. The constant awareness of those knocks felt like a presence breathing down my neck. My mind churned with thoughts. Could it be some person pranking me, an animal inside the walls, or something unexplainable, an entity I could not name or classify? I tried explaining the situation to a security consultant I contacted, describing strange noises at night. He listened patiently, then recommended a basic monitoring system. He spoke about installing cameras, motion sensors, and updated locks. I appreciated his professionalism, but I knew these measures wouldn't capture the intangible dread that crept along that back wall. Still, I had the camera set up, hoping they would record the cause of the KNX, or at least provide some peace of mind for a while. The recordings turned up nothing. The cameras did not pick up any human shapes or animals scurrying about. Yet the KN continued. Some nights I would run to the monitor in my office space, sweat beating on my forehead as I waited for the feed to reveal a stray cat or a trick of the wind. But the screens always showed only empty corridors and still crates. The silence in those images was maddening. Eventually, I decided I needed to confront the phenomenon head-on. I took a few days off from my usual tasks just to stay in the warehouse overnight and observe. I brought coffee, a portable radio, and braced myself to face the unknown. I remember the tension in my chest mounting as the hours crept past midnight. My radio's soft static was the only companion in that huge hollow space. The fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, throwing harsh shadows against the stacked products. Every so often, I walked to the back wall, letting the beam of my flashlight explore the metal panels and the cracks along the floor. Then, in the suffocating stillness of the early morning hours, it started a single tap, solid measured, followed by 2 more. My breath caught in my throat and a chill rippled through my body. Gripping my flashlight, in one hand, I crept toward the source. My footsteps felt thunderous against the concrete floor. When I reached the spot closest to the knock, I pressed my ear against the cold metal. The sound resonated through my skull, a hollow echo that made my insides lurch. The intensity of my heartbeat made me elated, but I forced myself to keep listening. It felt as though something was on the other side waiting. Testing my resolve, a wave of claustrophobia washed over me. I could barely swallow, my mouth so dry it felt as if it were filled with chalk. My limbs tingled, and a rush of heat flared at the back of my neck. I mentally begged the presence, whatever it was, to reveal itself plainly so I could stop feeling like I was losing my mind. And yet a deeper part of me dreaded the possibility of actually seeing it. I suspected that once I knew what it was, there would be no going back to the normal world. Outside these walls in that moment, I recalled how everything had seemed straightforward when I bought the warehouse, signed the documents, move an inventory, run the business. I never expected that an impenetrable fear would stake its claim here, threatening to consume my sanity. I realized I have neglected to do a thorough background check on the property, though no official record indicated anything unusual. I couldn't help but wonder if something had happened here. Some lingering echo, some fragment of energy trapped in the walls was determined to make itself heard. A few nights later, after consecutive bouts of sleeplessness, I stood near the back corner with a hammer. Telling myself I would tear open a portion of the wall if necessary, I was done with half measures. A suffocating dread gnawed at me, but curiosity and frustration drove me forward. I pried at a small section of the metal panel until I exposed the interior. My flashlight revealed only wooden supports and layers of insulation. I tapped the beam along the length of the inside half, expecting to see a hidden room or some bizarre object, but there was nothing remarkable, just dust. Mows swirling in the light, I sealed it back. Feeling more UNS settled than ever, the tension in the air was not dispelled. If anything, it felt heavier. It was as though the entity, if indeed it was an entity, mocked my efforts to rationalize or fix the situation. That same night around 3 in the morning, I heard not just tapping, but what sounded like the faint scraping of nails against metal. My breath came in quick, ragged gasps, and I felt my eyes burning with exhaustion and terror. My muscles tensed in involuntarily. My knees wobbled, threatening to buckle under me in a surge of panic. I grabbed my belongings and fled, leaving the warehouse lit like a beacon in the night. I spent the following day steeling myself to go back. I decided I wouldn't cower as evening fell. I returned with an even stronger flashlight and a sense of reckless resolve. I reminded myself that I had to know, was this phenomenon a trick of my own mind or something external? If it was inside my head, I needed to face it. If it was truly out there, I had to confront it. Neither possibility felt reassuring. My stomach churned as I walked along the perimeter, scanning each foot of the walls. At about midnight, the knock resumed, even bolder this time. 5 taps spaced out with deliberate pauses between each one. The intervals felt taunting, like an invitation. My heart thundered in my chest and sweat dripped down my temple. Every hair on my body was on end. I fought the urge to sprint for the exit. Instead, I forced myself forward, pressing my palms flat against the wall where the sound was strongest. I felt a faint vibration, rhythmic and steady. It was impossible to pretend it was random. Something was reacting to my presence as surely as if it were alive. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket, an alert from the security system. I glanced down to see that one of the cameras had detected motion in the back corner with trembling fingers. I pulled up the live feed. The screen showed a shadow. It wasn't a person, nor was it any recognizable shape. It was more like a trick of light, a swath of darkness that shouldn't have existed in that area. The lens flickered and the shape seemed to distort, stretching along the wall before disappearing as if it had melted into the metal. My blood ran cold. My breathing turned shallow and my vision swam for an instant. I realized my limbs were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Steady. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts, illusions, camera glitches, or something else, but I couldn't deny how intensely real it felt in that moment. My survival instinct flared, urging me to leave, yet I also felt compelled to stand my ground to see this through as though it were a test I had to pass with the phone still in hand. I took a step back from the wall, The overhead lights flickered, and the warehouse felt like it expanded and contracted. In time with my pulse, the next set of knocks echoed sharper than before. I thought I heard a faint, almost indiscernible whisper accompanying them, but I couldn't be certain the tension built until I felt dizzy, my lungs aching from shallow breathing. I forced in a deep breath and exhaled slowly, trying to steady my nerves. In that split second, I realized I couldn't stay in this place and maintain my sanity. Whatever dwelt here was beyond my comprehension. It was neither kindly revealing its nature nor leaving me in peace. My frustration and fear reached a breaking point. I had to make a decision, keep confronting something that might never show itself fully, or save what remained of my mental health and leave. I gathered my tools, locked the warehouse, and drove home. Under the pale glow of streetlights, my throat felt raw and my body trembled as adrenaline still coursed through my veins. Even in the silence of my car, I could almost hear the echo of that knocking reverberating in my skull back at my apartment. I stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying every moment in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that twisting shadow on the camera feed. I felt those impossibly deliberate knocks through my chest, as if something had reached inside me and tapped directly on my heart. By morning, I resolved not to abandon the warehouse entirely. I needed to run my business after all, and letting it sit unused wasn't an option. Instead, I set up new routines, deciding never to stay there alone. Deep into the night, I occupied myself with tasks during daylight hours, making sure to lock up before dusk. I kept the security system alerts active, but I tried to avoid reviewing them after midnight. Still, from time to time, an odd knock or thump would break the daytime quiet when that happened. My breath would catch, and I'd feel a trickle of cold sweat on the back of my neck, yet nothing else materialized in the light of day. It was as if the entity preferred the cloak of darkness, feeding on my fear when I was most vulnerable, and I in turn found a twisted peace in maintaining a schedule that denied it that power. It has been several months now, and I've learned to live with the unease. My gut twists with dread whenever I think about stepping inside. After sundown, my nights remain restless, haunted by a sound that I'm never fully sure I heard. I question whether all of this might be a manifestation of my own anxiety, maybe a trick of the mind brought on by stress, but that camera footage, the unexplainable shadow, is a stark reminder that something in that space defies any conventional explanation. I don't pretend to understand it. Perhaps it's a residual presence from a past I'll never discover. Maybe it's a fracture in reality that just happens to exist in those metal walls, beckoning with knocks and whispers. All I know is that the fear remains coiled in my chest like a dormant serpent ready to awaken at the faintest sound echoing through the dark. I survive by telling myself I've adapted. I run my business as best I can, and I try not to linger after sunset. The warehouse is more than just a storage space. Now it's a reminder that some places hold secret SEC we aren't meant to unravel, and every so often late at night I wake in a sweat, convinced I hear 3 knocks. I hold my breath, waiting for more, but the hush of my bedroom remains unbroken, and I'm left with a lingering terror that I can't quite name the knowledge that I felt something. Beyond reason scratches at the edges of my thoughts, relentless and impossible to ignore, and in that intangible darkness I find no comfort. Only the enduring sound of those 3 dull knocks that will never truly let me go. I felt uneasy the moment I stepped into that musty thrift store, though I couldn't explain why. It was as though the shadows in the aisles seemed darker than they should have been, that the rows of old furniture and rusted trinkets were leaning in. Despite that unsettling sensation, I pressed on, determined to find some retro frames for my newest decorating project. My heart gave a peculiar lurch when I spotted them in a dusty corner, a set of ornate old-fashioned frames stacked haphazard against a cracked mirror. Something about their chipped edges and faded gold paint drew me in, as if they had been waiting just for me. The air felt heavier. My skin started to prickle, but I brushed off those feelings, convincing myself that I was just excited about the find. How wrong I was. I'm a grown man with a passion for the past. The warmth of vintage decor always comforted me. Bold colors and art styles from bygone eras offer a soothing sense of nostalgia. I found half a dozen frames that day, each with its own distinct pattern of swirling lines, decorative flourishes, and tarnished corners. Only one seemed a bit off. Its glass panel was missing and the paper backing had yellowed with age, stained in a few places by what looked like ancient water damage. I remember thinking it was just a relic from some attic, maybe neglected by its previous owner, but I liked how it looked rugged and authentic, so I included it in my purchase at home. I arranged the frames on my living room floor, carefully selecting which posters would go best with each when I got to the odd frame. The musty smell of its stained backing made me wrinkle my nose. There was a faint outline on the paper, almost like a watermark. I assumed it was just the effect of time. I placed a newly printed vintage travel poster inside, then hung it on the wall above my record player. The rest of that afternoon was uneventful, just me humming along to old tunes and gently cleaning off the other frames. Yet there was this subtle undercurrent of anxiety and unexplainable knot in my chest that wouldn't go away. Over the next few days, I started noticing something peculiar whenever I walked by the frame. The poster was perfectly centered, but behind it, under that fragile yellow paper, I could have sworn I saw a faint shape forming. It looked like a diffuse shadow, hardly distinct enough to pin down, but definitely there. My pulse would race when I looked at it for too long. One evening, I decided to slide the poster out to inspect the backing more closely. I discovered those faint lines had become more pronounced, almost resembling the outline of a figure. A chill crawled up my spine, but I told myself it was probably just an old photo. Gras bleeding through papers can degrade in strange ways, and old pictures sometimes imprint themselves over time. I put the poster back, eager to dismiss that uncomfortable feeling gnawing at my mind. Strange occurrences began surfacing right around that time. In the middle of the night, I'd hear soft scraping sounds coming from the living room. My first thought was that I'd left a window open and a breeze was rustling something on a shelf. But upon checking, every window was securely latched. I just stand there in the dark, my heart thumping so loudly it seemed to echo in my ears. The living room, bathed in pale moonlight, felt colder than the rest of the house. It was as if the warmth couldn't reach that space anymore. I stood frozen, listening to my own ragged breath, searching for the slightest motion in the shadows. Nothing ever moved, but I could feel the air practically humming with tension. A week passed, and the shape on the backing grew sharper. I had begun taking pictures with my phone, mostly out of a strange fascination. Half convinced I was imagining it all in those photos. The shape was difficult to capture, but I could see it. If I tilted the screen, it was something like a silhouette. Clearly a human form turned away so that the shoulders, neck, and the back of the head were discernible. No face, no features, and yet it sent a jolt of electric fear through my veins. Each time I stared at it, it felt disrespectful to remove the poster entirely or to try scrubbing away that shape. Something told me that messing with it might escalate the oddness, but it didn't stop me from feeling creeped out. I remember a time late one evening when the living room light suddenly flickered. I was relaxing on the couch, mindlessly scrolling through social media, and the overhead lamp began to stutter. The effect was jarring, making the room blink from light to shadow. In rapid succession, my stomach lurched as my eyes flicked to the frame. The silhouette seemed to loom there, each flicker making it appear to waver, almost as though it were moving. A thick layer of sweat coated my palms, and a ring of cold sweat beaded around my temples. My heart felt as if it would burst from my chest, pounding away in raw panic. Then, without warning, the light steadied. Everything went quiet. My breathing was harsh and ragged. The frame sat innocently on the wall, but I was convinced that the silhouette had become a fraction clearer, as if it was turning. Friends dropped by. Occasionally curious to see the new decor, they mostly complimented my collection of vintage pieces, but nobody really commented on that particular frame. One acquaintance did glance at it and ask if there was some art hidden behind the poster. I felt my stomach twist. I told him there might be an old photograph back there, but I wasn't sure. He just shrugged, though. He looked slightly uneasy. That moment left a bitter taste in my mouth, like maybe I wasn't the only one sensing something was off over the next 2 weeks. I began to dread the living room. The corner where the frame hung felt different, as if it exuded a subtle energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Sometimes I caught myself rushing through the room, avoiding eye contact with that twisted, half-revealed image, but the feeling of being watched stuck to me like a film of sweat. My dreams grew restless, filled with shapes in the darkness and muffled whispers that seemed to pulse in my ears. Whenever I woke in the middle of the night, I couldn't shake the sense that something was standing just beyond the doorway waiting. It got worse one day when I went to take another photo of the frame's progression. The silhouette had changed. The figure now looked slightly angled, as if part of it had turned. It was still missing any real detail, but the orientation suggested it was no longer facing away. My blood ran cold. My head started to spin, and I felt the tang of adrenaline in the back of my throat. I told myself it was my imagination, but I couldn't ignore the evidence in the photo. My hands trembled, and my breath came in. Shallow, rapid bursts, a wave of nausea rolled through me as I realized that what I'd always dismissed as old photo residue seemed to be morphing slowly, methodically toward me. Nighttime brought a deeper layer of terror. I began hearing a faint tapping sound from the wall where the frame hung. It was so soft and intermittent that I couldn't pinpoint a pattern, but each knock, even if subtle, reverberated in my skull like a hammer strike lying in bed. I felt my pulse accelerate whenever I thought about the tapping. I told myself it was just the house settling or the wind outside, but deep down the dread festered my rational mind. War with an instinctual fear I could no longer deny the frame was changing. Something was inside it or tied to it, and it wanted my attention. My reflection in the glass of my other frames took on a ghostly quality. Whenever I walked by, I thought it was just the overhead light distorting me, but it seemed like my reflection was distorted in ways I couldn't explain. In the tarnished surfaces, I looked pale, drawn, and exhausted, my eyes bloodshot and ringed by dark circles. I realized then how much the stress was eating me alive. My appetite vanished, and I woke up every morning with my jaw clenched tight enough to cause pain. Finally, I decided I couldn't keep the frame on my wall any longer. I was losing sleep, plagued by the sense of being observed. My vision occasionally blurred at the edges when I looked at that cursed silhouette, as though the boundaries of the shape extended beyond the paper, creeping into the actual room. My heart pounded a drumbeat of dread that forced me to look away. One evening, I braced myself, turned on every light in the house, and took the frame. Off the wall, my hands shook violently as I carried it to my basement. Determined to banish it into a sealed storage box the moment I placed it inside the box and shut the lid. I felt as if I could breathe again, but my relief was short-lived. Even though I had locked the frame away, the memory of that silhouette remained vivid in my mind's eye. Each time I tiptoed to the basement stairs, a wave of apprehension hit me as if I feared catching sight of it at the bottom. My lungs felt tight, and I had to force myself to breathe slowly on. Some nights I could still hear that soft tapping sound. It was faint, but definitely coming from somewhere below. I'd stand there listening in paralyzed silence, while my pulse hammered so loudly it drowned out any other sound. One particularly unsettling night, I was jolted awake by a sudden crash. My entire body tensed, flooded by adrenaline. My mouth was dry and my heart thudded like a wild animal trapped in my chest. I checked every room upstairs, scanning with a flashlight before summoning the nerve to descend into the basement. The air down there was cold and smelled of damp concrete. Each step echoed ominously, my pulse roared in my ears, and my skin prickled with the certainty that I was not alone. When I reached the spot where I'd stored the frame, I nearly dropped my flashlight. The box had tipped over its lid, lying a few inches away. The frame itself was on the floor front side, facing up. The silhouette was there, a dark imprint on the yellowed backing, and it looked so much clearer than before, almost like a full figure leaning toward the glass. I had a moment of pure, unfiltered terror. My breath was ragged chest, constricting painfully. I felt my legs tremble with such force. I had to steady myself against a shelving unit in my mind. That shape was alive, or at least animated by some force. It was incomplete, but reaching for wholeness. Yet no matter how terrified I was, I still refused to toss it in the trash. Part of me feared that discarding it might provoke something worse, as if the attachment would persist regardless of where the frame ended up. Or maybe I was just too disturbed to confront the idea of someone else finding it. I carefully placed it in another box, wrapped it in layers of old cloth, sealed it with duct tape, and tucked it in the far corner. When I climbed back upstairs, I was dizzy with panic, but I locked the door behind me, clinging to the faint hope that distance and confinement would keep it at bay. To this day, I can't set foot in that basement without feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. My heart still races whenever I picture that dark silhouette. It started as a faded stain, an almost invisible shape, and it grew with a terrifying certainty until it was almost fully formed. Something about it made my insides curl with apprehension. Even now, a few months removed from the incident, I'll catch myself glancing at the hallway leading to the basement door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. I hear tiny creaks in the dead of night, maybe the house, maybe something else. It leaves me breathless with dread. There's no proof that the frame is doing anything, but I can't shake the feeling that it's slowly drawing closer, that the boundaries separating it from me are weakening. I don't think I'll ever truly shake that sensation of being watched some nights. I force myself to sleep with music playing, anything to drown out the whispery silence. My mind replays the image of that silhouette so close to having a face leaning forward as though it wanted to pull itself out of the paper every time I recall it. My lung seize up and my breath stutters. I still have no logical explanation. Perhaps the frame carried an imprint of something that was never meant to be seen. Or maybe it was all in my head, a slow unraveling fueled by stress and imagination. But each time my thoughts wander in that direction, I remember the pictures I took. They are still on my phone, though I rarely dare to look at them in those photos. The silhouette's progression is undeniable, a grotesque sequence of emergence. I don't want to know what would have happened if I'd let it fully materialize. I can only hope that by hiding it away, I've halted whatever process was unfolding, yet the house remains eerily quiet. I sometimes wonder if it's waiting, if that presence bides its time. Aware that one day I might venture back downstairs for something trivial, only to find the box torn open again. That thought is enough to send chills racing along my arms, to set my teeth on edge and make my stomach churn with dread. For now, I live with the oppressive atmosphere in my own home, the knowledge that a hidden horror lurks below, sealed but not destroyed. There are times I consider calling some expert in the paranormal or just dragging the box to a faraway dumpster, but a gnawing voice in my head warns that it could follow me wherever I go when I'm alone in the living room at night with only the faint glow of a floor lamp. I can feel its eyes if it even has them, tracing my every movement through walls and layers of cloth. The memory of its steady progression from a faint discoloration to a nearly formed figure has lodged itself in my thoughts, festering, and so I exist in a restless stalemate, locked in a silent battle of wills with something I neither understand nor trust. Ultimately, the real horror is not that I still sense its presence. It's that I'm never entirely sure if the fear is in my head or in that frame. Either way, the dread sits in the pit of my stomach, a constant reminder that some things are best left undisturbed. I try to move on with life, telling myself I've taken care of the problem by burying it in the basement. But late at night, when the house creaks just so and the darkness seems to push in from all sides, I'm reminded of that creeping silhouette inching forward on the stained papers, silently threatening to break free. And that's a feeling I can't outrun, no matter how many lights I leave on. Still remember the first time I heard that phone ring in the middle of the night. The sound sliced through the silence with an unexpected softness, almost like a distant lullaby gone wrong. My body tensed immediately and a crawling unease settled in my gut. I realized then that something in my home was not right. Something was awake at that hour, beckoning me into a world I'd never asked to enter from. That moment, my home office, once a safe place of late-night productivity, became a stage for a creeping sense of dread that refuses to let me rest. I work from home as a freelancer, so transforming the spare bedroom into an office seemed the logical thing to do. The desk faces the window, a simple wooden table covered in notes, and a perpetually half coffee mug. The overhead light always struck me as too bright, so I set up a small floor lamp in the corner for a warmer atmosphere. Late into the night, that light casts the elongated shadows against the walls, giving me a strange impression of movement whenever I glance up from my computer screen. It's not uncommon for me to continue working. Past midnight, caught in the momentum of meeting deadlines, answering emails, or revising projects. Everything changed the first time I heard the phone ring after 2 in the morning. I remember pausing mid-typing my heart, giving a single hard thump. The ring wasn't as loud as my usual ringtone. There was a softness to it, an almost tentative quality. My gut reaction was confusion. I rarely use the landline, and even during the day, it seldom rings at that hour. It made no sense whatsoever. My mouth went dry, and I tried to collect myself, telling myself it had to be a spam call or a mistake. I lifted the receiver silence, then came a faint static like distant radio interference. I listened for several seconds, bracing for someone's voice, but no one spoke. I felt cold sweat beat on my forehead and a restless prickle course down my arms. There was a deep rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but too faint to be sure. Eventually, I whispered a greeting into the receiver, trying to sound composed. No answer, just that subtle static followed by an empty click. In the following days, I contacted my telephone provider asking if they had records of calls in the middle of the night. They told me there were none. They insisted that if a call hadn't been logged, it simply hadn't happened, and suggested maybe it was an internal line glitch, a wiring problem, or even something triggered by my internet router. I tried to accept that explanation deep down, though. I couldn't shake the memory of that soft ring and the uneasy hush on the other end. I tested the phone in the early 2000s evening and found no issues by the time midnight came. I was convinced I'd been spooked by a technical glitch. I worked calmly until I felt that familiar yawn telling me it was time to shut everything down. I almost reached for the light switch when I glanced at the clock, 2:05 a.m. A jolt of apprehension coiled in my chest as I realized I'd let time get away from me, but nothing happened. No ringing, no strange hush over the line. That relief was short-lived. The very next night, I stayed up late again, juggling multiple deadlines. My eyes stung from staring at the screen, the quiet hum of the computer. My only companion, the overhead light, stayed off, and the warm glow of the floor lamp created dancing shadows. Sometime after 2, I heard it again. That same soft, almost mournful ring floated through the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest, and I froze adrenaline surging through my veins. I tried to steady my breathing as I rose to pick up the receiver, fully aware that this time I was doing it against my better judgment. The plastic felt cold against my ear, and the same static greeted me, a whispered hiss that made my neck prickle with goosebumps. I could swear I heard an exhalation, someone or something on the other side, letting out a breath, then a low crackle in silence. It got worse from there. I decided to unplug the phone altogether. I went so far as to remove the line from the wall. I thought I'd severed the last connection that phone had yet. 2 nights later, I caught myself in the same situation, working too late, too absorbed in my tasks to notice how quickly the clock had inched past 2. The lamp glow had taken on a menacing quality, every subtle movement of air making the curtain shift in a way that seemed full of intent. A creeping paranoia settled in my mind. I felt as though the shadows were stretching themselves toward me. I tried to tell myself that was nonsense, that I was simply tired. Then the phone rang, that same maddeningly soft tone brushed through the dead of night. I stared in disbelief at the device, powerless to resist a crawling dread that set every muscle in my body rigid. The line was unplugged, yet the phone was ringing. My pulse throbbed in my ears, my palms grew clammy, and my breath hitched. I'll never forget the chill that enveloped me as I picked up the receiver this time. The sense of presence on the other end was more pronounced than before. It wasn't just breathing. Now it felt watchful. If that's the right word, my skin crawled as a quiet, almost imperceptible hiss emanated through the earpiece. The realization that there should be no dial tone, no connection at all, slammed into me. I dropped the receiver as though it had burned my hand and stumbled backward. The phone stopped ringing and the office returned to silence, but the tension in the air was palpable, as though something lingered crouched in the shadows. By that point, I'd grown wary of my own office at night. I noticed how after midnight the lamp seemed to cast a more oppressive glow than usual. The corners of the room got dark, darker, blacker than the Rest of the hallway, the air grew stale as if a presence hovered there, siphoning off the oxygen. Even when I tried to ignore it, my body reacted. My heart would pound for no reason. My breathing grew shallow whenever I turned my back to the room. I began to feel an irrational urge to look over my shoulder, expecting to find something lurking behind me, something just out of sight one evening. I avoided the office altogether. I stayed in the living room laptop on my knees, sipping coffee to stay awake. I was determined not to cross the threshold of that room around 1 in the morning. I realized I needed a file I'd left on my office desk. A voice in my mind pleaded with me to stay away, but deadlines didn't care about my superstition. I stepped into the hallway, the path ahead illuminated only by the faint glow from the living room lamp. The door to the office was barely ajar. I could see the shadowy outlines of furniture, and oppressive hush weighed down on the corridor as though the entire house was holding its breath. I forced myself inside, ignoring the tremor in my legs. My tongue felt thick, and a faint buzzing in my ears started up. I switched on the overhead light. The sudden brightness revealed nothing out of place but the dread still pressed in. I grabbed the file from my desk, refusing to linger. Then I heard a soft click. Not the ring this time, just a single muted click. I froze every hair on the back of my neck standing on end. It had come from near the phone, my eyes locked onto the device. It sat silent and still as it should. Yet the air around it felt charged. I could almost imagine something leaning over it, a shape draped in shifting shadows. My mouth went dry and I backed out of the room without breaking eye contact with that corner. I turned off the lights, slammed the door, and rushed down the hall in the living room. I realized I was shaking my heart. Thundered in my ears, sweat trickled down my temples, and my breathing was ragged. I felt as if I had narrowly escaped something I couldn't. To fine over the next few nights, I tried different tactics. Leaving the office door closed at all times, turning on music, even keeping every light in the house lit. Yet whenever I crossed that threshold, especially after midnight, my body reacted as if I were stepping into a predator's lair. The phone continued its phantom calls at random intervals. Sometimes it would remain silent for several nights. Other times it would ring more than once. The hush on the other end, longer, more deliberate, like a present. Studying me through the line, it was becoming clear that something was attached to that office, or perhaps to me. Whenever I was in it, my sense of reality wavered. I began questioning whether I was losing my mind, conjuring these experiences out of overwork or anxiety. But each time the phone rang, that same creeping horror coiled in my belly, insisting that whatever was happening was very real. I felt it in the prickling of my scalp, the dryness of my mouth, the wild hammering of my pulse. At last, I decided I had to confront it. I planned to stay in the office past 2 in the morning, phone plugged in or not determined to answer. No matter how many times it rang, in a strange way, I wanted to force a resolution, even if it meant facing the unthinkable. That night, I sat at my desk with the main overhead light on the floor lamp dark in the corner, casting the left side of the room in a murky gloom. The house was still the only sound, the faint buzz of electricity through the lights. My palms were sweaty, my throat tight, but I refused to back down the clock. CED toward 2, my eyes flickered to the phone, anticipation tightening the knot in my stomach. 2 minutes passed, nothing. 5 minutes, 10. I found myself exhaling in relief, wondering if I had finally rid myself of this bizarre haunting. Then it rang soft and insistent. My heart felt like it crashed into my ribs, and I snatched the receiver on the first ring. The hush was immediate, as though the line existed in a separate realm. The static returned, but this time it throbbed with an underlying tension. My pulse hammered, cold sweat trickling down my spine. I asked aloud who was there. Though my voice wavered with fear, I heard a faint intake of breath and a muted rustling-like movement on the other side. Something in my mind snapped, and I slammed the receiver down. Yanking the cord from the wall, I felt a surge of panic and anger, and urge to rip the phone from its cradle and throw it across the room. Instead, I forced myself to remain there, fists clenched so tightly my knuckles ached. I wanted to speak to demand this presence reveal itself, but I knew deep inside no real answers would come. There was no logic behind this phenomenon, no simple explanation. It was simply there, shadowy and insidious afterward. I packed up my work, shut off the office light, and stepped out into the hallway. Before I closed the door behind me, I glimpsed the phone sitting in the dimness. In that moment, the phone looked more like an idol on a shrine than an outdated piece of technology. The air in the office felt unbearably heavy, as if the walls were pressing inward. My muscles quivered with tension, and my breath came in shallow, rapid bursts. Yet I walked away, leaving the darkness to swallow that cursed space. Now I avoid working there at night. I stick to the living room or my bedroom after midnight, as if letting the office slumber might calm the strange force lurking within it. Sometimes, though, I hear the echo of that soft ring in my dreams resonating through distant corridors of sleep. I wake up trembling, heart racing, convinced I can feel a presence standing outside my bedroom door. I don't know if I'll ever uncover the origin of that uncanny phone call or the presence behind it. A part of me doubts there's any logic to it at all. Perhaps some boundary between our world and something else is thinned, allowing that call to filter through. Or maybe my own anxieties conjured an impossible manifestation. Either way, my sense of safety is forever shaken. I know now that some walls can hide a darkness we can never truly understand, and every time I catch a glimpse of the clock inching toward 2 in the morning, I feel that old dread slink back into my chest, reminding me that no matter how many times I ignore it, the phone can still ring in the dead of night, soft, persistent, and waiting for me to listen. In the first time I heard the noise, I dismissed it as the house settling. It was nearly midnight and the TV was murmuring in the background while I half dozed on the couch. Yet in the midst of that haze between waking and sleep, I caught a distinct sound water running, followed by the unmistakable rasp of brick bristles against teeth. My entire body tensed as a sudden chill raced from my neck down my spine, jolting me awake. I froze, focusing on the sound, and felt my heart begin to pound, like a dull drum in my ears. It seemed to come from the guest bathroom, the one in the room I almost never used. At first, I thought I was dreaming. I remember forcing myself to stand. Every step down the dark hallway felt heavier than the last. I flicked on the light in the guest room and peeked inside, trying to steady my breath. Nothing was out of place. The bed was untouched. The floor was spotless. I slipped into the bathroom, half expecting to find puddles, or at least a dripping faucet, but the porcelain sink was completely dry. There was no sign that any water had flowed at all. My hands felt clammy, and when I finally exhaled, I realized how tightly I'd been holding my breath. I told myself it had to be a trick of my imagination, maybe a leftover snippet of a dream, despite telling myself I was just tired. Something lingered in the back of my mind. It was an odd prickling that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I retreated to my living room, turned off the TV, and decided to go to bed. I tried to push the incident from my thoughts as I lay in the darkness, but the more I tried to relax, the louder my pulse became. It was as if my body knew something I was unwilling to admit. Sleep that night was shallow and filled with strange, half-remembered nightmares. They all dissolved by morning, leaving behind only unease and a dull ache in my temples. Days passed without incident, and I nearly convinced myself I had imagined the entire thing. But one night later that week, when the clock hovered around midnight again, there it was running water. The sharp scrape of bristles, soft but unmistakable. My throat went dry, and I felt a cold sweat blooming across my forehead. I pressed the TV mute button and strained my ears. My heart hammered. It wasn't a random clang of pipes or the air conditioner cycling. I couldn't deny what I was hearing. Someone or something was brushing teeth in the guest bathroom. I stood, every muscle tense, then slowly made my way to the back of the house. The hallway light flickered slightly, but I'm sure that was just my imagination, amplifying every tiny quiver of electricity. With one shaky hand, I reached for the guest room doorknob. A surge of adrenaline rushed through my veins, making my breathing ragged. My fingers trembled as I pushed the door open, bracing myself for whatever I might find again. Nothing. The bathroom sink was bone dry. The mirror was as spotless as I had left it. Yet I felt a presence. It was like stepping into a room moments after someone leaves. There was a faint warmth in the air, a subtle shift that suggested I was not alone. Yet by all appearances, I was convinced it might be a plumbing issue. I contacted a plumber the next morning. I described the noise in vague terms, saying I heard the pipes rattling or water running when it shouldn't. He inspected every inch of the place. In an even tone, he told me the plumbing was in perfect condition. There were no leaks, no blockages, no damaged pipes. He asked if I had heard any banging in the walls or if the water pressure had changed. I admitted everything seemed normal except for the phantom noises. At midnight, he simply shrugged, collected his payment, and left, telling me to call him if something more concrete occurred. The following nights were a test of my sanity. The sound returned again and again at almost the exact same time. I began to dread the approach of midnight. During the day, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things at night when I heard the soft brushing and the water rushing. My rational mind dissolved into panic. My palms would sweat, my heart would gallop, and my breathing would turn so shallow that my chest started to ache. I felt a pervasive sense of dread, as though my own house was turning against me. The guest room door, always closed, became a symbol of something I couldn't control or understand. I tried to distract myself. Watched comedies on television, played music at a louder volume than usual, even left lights on all over the house. But every time, just when I managed to relax, I'd hear that quiet trickling of water, that faint brushing that made my teeth itch. It got to the point where my anxiety lingered throughout the day. My appetite shrank. My sleep became restless, and I found myself constantly glancing at the clock, waiting for the dreaded hour. My reflection in the bathroom mirror each morning showed dark circles under my eyes and a tension in my jaw that never truly went away. Eventually, I worked up the courage to stay in the guest room overnight, hoping to catch whatever was happening. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might burst as midnight approached. I fought the urge to flee. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, my hands cold and clammy sweat gathering at the nape of my neck. The only light came from a small lamp I had dragged. In casting deep shadows across the walls, each minute felt stretched thin, and every tiny noise made me start. Then it began. The faucet turned on gently at first, and my pulse skyrocketed. I had to fight to keep my breathing steady. I could almost feel the presence in the bathroom. Slowly, I rose. The floor creaked as I stepped toward the half-opened door. The reflection in the mirror was not my own. It was a faint outline, the vague shape of a person leaning over the sink, brushing their teeth. My whole body went rigid. I couldn't see details, only a silhouette that moved in a disturbingly human way. My stomach churned and my vision blurred at the edges. A metallic taste crept into my mouth as though fear itself had a flavor. My instincts shouted at me to run, but I stayed. The figure's hand paused mid-motion as if it sensed my presence in a blink. The faucet shut off and the mirror returned to normal. The only person I saw was me, trembling and pale eyes wide with terror. I staggered backward, gasping for air, heart pounding so loudly I was sure the neighbors would hear it. My skin prickled with clammy sweat and my fingers shook violently. I spent the rest of the night lying awake on the guest bed, too petrified to leave the room, too horrified to close my eyes. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination, a waking nightmare born of stress and exhaustion. Yet the memory of that silhouette haunted me over the next few days. Small details began to change around the house. I started finding the guest room door slightly ajar, even though I always closed it. The light in that hallway flickered more than it should. The air smelled faintly of toothpaste. Though I couldn't locate its source at random moments, I felt a presence behind me, an acute pressure on my shoulders as though something loomed there. I'd whirl around, adrenaline surging, but never saw anything except my own shadow. Each time my heart hammered so powerfully that I'd feel dizzy, I began to doubt my senses, questioning every creak, every whisper of the wind. My own house felt malevolent. The walls seemed to close in on me at times, and I'd break into a cold sweat. Sure, I was losing my mind. I recalled old stories of hauntings, but I always dismissed them as fantasy. Yet here I was feeling like some malevolent force had rooted itself in my home. I tried explaining the situation to a friend over the phone, leaving out the stranger parts. I just said I felt uneasy, that maybe I needed a vacation. He suggested I get some rest and mentioned he'd come by to check on me if I wanted. I politely declined. Having someone else in the house felt more terrifying than being alone, because I couldn't shake the sense that an extra witness might worsen the situation or confirm it was real, in a way I wasn't prepared to handle. When the sound returned that night, it felt louder, more insistent. The brushing lasted longer, and the faucet's gurgle seemed almost angry. My skin crawled. My breathing went shallow, and I felt the frantic beat of my heart pulsing in my neck. I decided I had to confront it. Summoning every ounce of courage, I rushed into the guest bathroom the moment I entered. The noise ceased, the faucet was dry, and the mirror only showed my terrified expression. Eyes wide as saucers, yet there was a subtle shift in the air. A faint heat that made me shudder. Something had been there. A second before, something that I had interrupted, a dizzying wave of nausea hit me, and I clutched the sink for support. My reflection stared back, contorted with fear. That's when I saw it. A streak of water, barely visible, trailing down the mirror's surface. I brushed my finger against it. It was indeed damp, a tiny smear of moisture, though the faucet was still off. That minuscule drop felt like undeniable proof. My mind spun, and I had to press my hand to my chest to calm the wild rhythm of my heart. In a state of near panic, I decided to leave the house entirely. I grabbed my car keys, locked up, and drove aimlessly under the glaring glow of streetlights, trying to outrun the suffocating dread. Eventually, I parked in a quiet lot and attempted to steady. My rattled nerves, my throat felt constricted, and every breath scraped my lungs like sandpaper. My fingers still trembled on the steering wheel after what felt like hours. I managed to steel myself. The house was mine. I told myself I had to face whatever was inside, but deep down I knew I wouldn't stay. Unless I had some method of asserting control, when I returned, I marched straight to the guest room, flicked on every light, and left the door open. I stared at the mirror, half expecting that silhouette to reappear. It never did while I watched. But now every night the brushing continues. Sometimes the faucet runs. Sometimes I only hear the faint squeak of bristles against enamel. I sleep with a door locked between me and that room, yet I feel its presence in my dreams. I've stopped telling anyone about it. I feel like I'm living on the edge of reality, teetering between reason and something far darker. My house remains silent during the day, but at night the atmosphere becomes suffocating. The air thickens, the walls seem to hum with anticipation, and I'm left alone with the dreadful certainty that I share my home with something else. Even now, as I write this, I sense it. It's nearly midnight, and a soft shuffle. Echoes from the guest bathroom. My heart is hammering, and I'm covered in a fine layer of sweat. But I can't bring myself to go down that hall again. Something is there, continuing a nightly ritual that shouldn't exist. Part of me wants to flee to never return, but a stronger part of me is too fascinated or too terrified to abandon this place. I'm caught in a spiral of fear and curiosity, doomed to wonder if the next time I enter that bathroom, I'll see more than just a second silhouette. I don't think I want to know who or what it truly is. Yet I stay bracing myself for the inevitable scraping of bristles against teeth and the quiet rush of water in a place that's meant to be empty. I first stepped into the attic of the old music school on a cold, drizzly evening, and immediately felt as though I had walked into a place outside of time. The air smelled of mildew and dried varnish. Layers of dust thick on every exposed surface. A single overhead bulb flickered with a dull hum, casting swaying shadows against the slanted walls. I felt my pulse quicken the moment the door clicked shut behind me, although I tried to tell myself that the chill running through my spine was just the draft creeping in from the rafters. It already felt like I was trespassing somewhere I shouldn't be. Like the building itself was warning me that I had entered a realm meant for ghosts and memories, not for the living. I had been looking for a place to rehearse my guitar at night, and one of the administrators suggested this attic as an ideal spot. He explained in a subdued tone that it was rarely used anymore because of its cluttered state. He mentioned that the school's older instruments were stored below. Not up here, so I'd have the entire floor to myself and could practice without disturbing anyone. It sounded appealing. In theory, a quiet, secluded space that had once been a lively part of the school's heritage and practice, though the attic was unsettling from the first moment I set foot inside. The windows were stained with grime, letting in little more than a sickly grayish glow even in daytime. By night, the place was nearly pitch black, except for the single bulb above my head that seemed on the verge of flickering out every few seconds as I set up my small amp and laid my guitar case on the floorboards. I could feel the boards creak and moan beneath my shoes. The distant echoes of those creaks reverberated in the attics. Cavernous space, the walls were lined with towering shelves of sheet music. So old their edges were yellowed and curled, broken violins, busted clarinets, and battered brass instruments lay scattered on a large wooden table that looked equally antique. I remember brushing past a cello with a large crack down its side, the string hanging limply like dead weight. Every corner seemed to hide some relic of a past era, and the silence had a texture thick and heavy as though the air was weighed down by all these forgotten compositions on my first few nights. Nothing remarkable happened. I strummed chords, practiced scales, and tried to ignore the little rustling sounds from within the piles of debris. I reasoned it might be mice, or just the old wood settling. But I started noticing something. Peculiar. Whenever I paused my playing in the stillness, there would come this faint, almost imperceptible tinkling of piano notes. At first it was so soft I thought my ears were ringing, but it happened repeatedly, always when I stopped. Never while I was in the middle of a riff. I tried tracing it, but the notes seemed to come from different corners of the attic. Each time I told myself it could be noise drifting up from below, but the staff insisted that all the piano were kept on the first floor. Besides, they would say everyone was gone by that hour the next week. Those faint notes turned louder. My first reaction was to scold my imagination. Maybe I was just hearing residual echoes from my own music, but there was no denying that it was distinctly piano-like-y. I even told one of the night custodians in passing about the strange notes. He looked at me with an expression somewhere between pity and concern. Then shrugged. He mentioned indirectly that I was probably working too hard, letting my mind play tricks on me. I nodded in agreement, but I didn't really believe it was a trick of my own imagination. The notes had a clarity that I couldn't just wave off one evening after a particularly frustrating practice session. I stopped to rest my fingers. My heart was already beating a bit faster than normal, more from nerves than exertion. The overhead light flickered, casting a momentary darkness across the attic. Then I heard it, a series of strong, confident piano chords played with undeniable force. It was so clear and bold, I almost dropped my guitar. My skin erupted in goosebumps, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I carefully set my instrument aside and made my way toward the far end of the attic where I felt the notes were coming from each step, sent the old floorboards squeaking and groaning, the echoes bouncing off the wall like mocking laughter. My breathing was shallow, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The corridor of shelves seemed to elongate unnaturally as I walked, as though the space was distorting around me by the time I reached the corner where I was sure the sound originated. The piano playing had stopped. All I found was a ragged, dusty cover for what might have once been an upright piano, but there was no piano beneath it, just empty space and a scattering of cobweb that brushed against my arm, making me recoil with a shudder. An irrational panic spiked inside me. I spun around, half expecting to see someone lurking behind the shelves, but there was nothing, just the silence bearing down on me like a physical presence thicker than any darkness I had felt before. My lungs felt tight, and I struggled to control my breathing. Eventually, I forced my trembling legs to carry me back to my corner of the attic. I turned up the volume on my amp, determined to drown out any stray sounds with my guitar. Deep down, I knew I was just trying to chase away whatever presence I was beginning to suspect. Shared the space with me over the next few nights, my tension grew into a kind of paranoia. Every flicker of light, every accidental movement in the corner of my vision made my stomach twist. Even the scratch of my pick against the guitar strings started to sound ominous in my own ears. Yet I tried to cling to rational explanations. I considered that maybe the old school's ventilation system created odd echoes, or that some distant practice room below was still in use, even though I was told otherwise. But these rationalizations started to crumble when I realized that the piano chords came almost in direct conversation with my guitar playing. Whenever I paused for more than a few seconds, a melody would rise like a mocking echo from an unseen pianist who lurked behind the walls. I began to dread the nights I would catch myself hesitating at the attic door, heartbeat already racing before I even ascended the stairs. My palms would sweat so much that holding the guitar became difficult. My mouth felt perpetually dry and my skin would prickle with a cold sweat at random intervals. Sometimes as I reached the top of the stairs, I had the unsettling sensation that there was someone waiting for me just around the corner staring, though I saw no one. The staff, when I indirectly mentioned my discomfort, politely reassured me that the attic was safe and that no piano was stored there. Their polite smiles only made me feel more isolated, as if I were the only one experiencing this creeping dread. One night I decided that I had to confront whatever this was. Maybe I was cracking under stress, or maybe there was actually some intangible presence haunting the attic. Either way, I needed to face it to break the cycle of fear. As soon as I arrived, I set my guitar down and walked the length of the attic in silence. My heart hammered in my chest, my legs felt weak, and I could hardly draw a full breath. The overhead bulb flickered incessantly as though it too was on edge. I moved every chair, every stack of sheet music, and every empty instrument case I could find, searching for anything that might be producing the piano sounds, yet nothing turned up. The only thing that caught my eye was an old photograph pinned to a rotting corkboard. It showed a group of adults standing in front of a piano that had the same distinct cover I had seen folded in the corner, even in that photograph. The people's expressions looked grave, as though the camera had captured a moment of hushed tension. When I finished my fruitless search, I decided to play my guitar one last time. For the night, my nerves were frayed and every chord sounded out of tune to my paranoid ears. Then it started again. The familiar melodic piano phrase echoing from some hidden corner of the attic. This time, it was more than just a set of random notes. It was a full, coherent passage, something with structure and feeling. My throat went tight and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I turned off my amp, letting the hush settle over me. In that silence, the phantom piano continued a slow, deliberate tune that escalated into an almost triumphant cascade of notes. My teeth began chattering, not from cold, but from sheer terror. I couldn't stand it any longer, gripping my guitar in its case like a shield. I rushed toward the attic door. My foot slipped on a scattered pile of sheet music, sending me tumbling into a dusty old drum kit. The crash echoed painfully in my ears, and for a moment I was engulfed in a whirlwind of dust and metallic clanging. My heart was pounding so violently I thought it might burst. The piano playing ceased instantly, as though disturbed by my CL miming. Finally, I scrambled to my feet, flung the attic door open, and practically bolted down the narrow stairs in the corridor below. I collapsed against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. My arms were shaking uncontrollably, and my vision blurred with tears of both frustration and fear. My mind raced with questions. Was I going insane? Was this building harboring something? Beyond explanation, despite how terrifying it was. Part of me felt an irresistible pull to find the truth, but another part of me simply wanted to abandon the attic and never return. After regaining a shred of composure, I mustered the courage to speak indirectly to one of the senior staff members. I described a persistent noise that sounded like piano music, and I pressed him to confirm whether any old pianos might still be lurking in the attic. He insisted with quiet certainty that there were none. His grave expression told me he believed I had truly heard something but had no explanation for it. Something in the way he gripped his own hands too tightly made me suspect he wasn't sharing everything he knew. Nonetheless, he gave no indication of any known tragedy or horrific event. He only repeated that the attic had been cleared of instruments. Long ago, I made the decision that very night to end my sessions in the attic at around midnight. I carefully gathered my guitar and walked up the stairs one last time to retrieve the rest of my belongings. The air felt 10 times as heavier, as if the attic had awakened and was watching me. I kept my eyes locked. Straight ahead, unwilling to peek into the corners, the single bulb swung gently, casting those same menacing shadows that seemed to taunt me the moment I got what I needed. I felt a pressure on the back of my neck like a cold hand pressing down. I froze, heart racing, sweat stinging my eyes, but I forced myself to move, step by trembling step, until I left that room behind. Leaving the school that night, I felt no relief, only a pervasive sense of dread that clung to me. Even when I got home, my ears rang with the echo of those unseen piano chords. My mind replayed that final moment of silence in which I felt the presence behind me. Part of me feared that the attic's influence might follow me, that the eerie music might echo again in my dreams or seep into my thoughts when least expected. In the days since, the memory of that attic lingers like a persistent chill. No matter how many other places I practice, I can't shake the feeling that I left a question unanswered. Sometimes I still think I hear a piano's faint melody in the dead of night. It reminds me of that oppressive silence and the flickering overhead light. I haven't set foot in the attic again, but it feels as though my escape was only partial, like I merely stepped back from an open doorway without truly closing it. And maybe that's the most disturbing realization of all. There are some places and some presences that resist any attempt at explanation or resolution. They remain behind, waiting quietly, haunting the corners of our minds and the shadows of old buildings, ready to remind us that sometimes the most terrifying thing is never seeing what lurks just out of sight. The sky had turned a deep gray the evening I first sensed something was not right with the old townhouse. It was the kind of evening when every shadow seems a little longer, every creak of floorboards seems a little louder, and an uneasy chill hangs in the air. Long after the sun sets, even before I unlocked the front door, I felt a pressure in my chest, a quiet warning that this place harbored secrets. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed the echo of my own heartbeat in my ears, an unsteady thump-thump that refused to calm. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than my mind toying with me. How could I have known it was the first sign of something much darker? I am a middle-aged man, quiet by nature, and I've never been the type to dwell on local legends or superstitions. When I moved into this townhouse tucked away in the historic district of a centuries-old city, I was more excited about its vintage charm than concerned about any sinister lore. The landlord assured Ed me the house was old but in decent condition. In fairness, the creaking floorboards and drafty windows seemed par for the course in any aging residence, so I wasn't alarmed by the typical quirks. Everything felt normal for a time. The first few weeks I kept a predictable routine: work all day, return in the early evening, fix a simple dinner, maybe watch some television or read a book, then retire for the night. I found the musty aroma of the townhouse almost comforting in its familiarity. Wooden beams overhead gave the place a rustic warmth, and the spiral staircase leading up to the attic had an undeniable old-world appeal. Perhaps the only odd design quirk was the attic itself. It stretched across the entire top floor, but contained smaller recesses. I initially assumed were built to maximize storage. One afternoon, I decided to finally unpack the last of my boxes in the attic, an activity I had postponed for too long. The attic was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb that seemed older than the building itself. Dust swirled in the stale air, and the wooden steps groaned under my weight. My footsteps echoed in the stillness almost immediately. I became aware of the claustrophobic atmosphere, angled beams, low ceilings, and thick, shadowy corners. I couldn't fully see, even with the light on, as I stacked boxes and tried to find space. I noticed a faint line along one wall near, concealed by shadows. It looked like a narrow door or a removable panel. My pulse quickened. The air felt heavier. I approached the seam and gave it a gentle push. Sure enough, it pivoted inward with a quiet scrape, revealing a cramped, hidden compartment that smelled of old leather and rotting paper inside. There was little beyond cobwebs and dust except for a long piece of wood, perhaps the length of my forearm, leaning against the far wall. A wave of unease swept over me as though I were an uninvited guest in some private space. I lifted the wood carefully. noticing that many names were etched into its surface. Most were carved in an old-fashioned script that looked like it belonged in a museum. I leaned closer, trying to decipher them. Most names were unfamiliar, which wasn't a surprise. However, in the center I saw a larger inscription in faded dark paint. To my horror, it was my own name. Not just a coincidence or a common name that resembled mine, but exactly my name with the same distinctive spelling I've seldom encountered in anyone else. My stomach lurched and a cold sweat prickled at the back of my neck. The attic's stale air suddenly seemed thick and suffocating, like I was breathing through a heavy blanket. I could think of no logical explanation. The townhouse wasn't especially old, maybe a century at most. My family has never lived in this region. As far as I know, there were no relatives with my name who might have stayed here in that moment. The realization that I was alone with this impossible artifact made my hands tremble. My heart drummed against my ribcage, fighting the urge to flee. I remained still, listening for any sign of someone else in the house. The silence was suffocating. I placed the piece of wood back into the hidden space, closed the panel, and tried to steady my breathing. The boards under my feet, Faye felt unstable, like they might give way at any moment. My mind tumbled through questions: who carved these names? Why is my name there? How long has it been there? Rationality insisted that there must be an explanation, maybe a prank by a previous tenant. But dread gwed at me from within. I retreated down the stairs, nearly stumbling in my hurry. Days passed, yet I couldn't shake the memory. The echo of my name on that piece of wood haunted me. It hovered in the corners of my mind, intruding whenever I tried to concentrate on my work. Eventually, I decided to confront the landlord. I explained that I found a strange object in the attic. Something with multiple names carved on it, including mine. I tried to keep my voice steady, though my palms were clammy. The landlord seemed perplexed. He said he had never heard of such a thing in that house, and reminded me that old places often contain leftover debris from former inhabitants. I left the conversation unconvinced, but forced myself to accept his dismissal. It was easier to cling to the Bal explanation than dwell on the more frightening possibilities. A few nights after that discussion, I awoke to the sharp sound of wood shifting upstairs. The noise was so startling that I bolted upright in bed. Chest pounding, my bedroom door was closed, but a faint glow from the streetlights outside cast long, distorted shadows on the wall. A throbbing sensation coursed through my temples. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, but something about the rhythm of the creaking steps sounded deliberate, like cautious footsteps, a quiet. Panic seized me, each breath felt tight in my lungs, and a layer of sweat dampened my hairline. Despite the overwhelming urge to pull the blankets over my head, I forced myself to get up, but by the time I summoned the courage to open the door, the attic was quiet again. The next morning, I felt a dull tension in my muscles, as if my body hadn't fully rested. My coffee tasted bitter, and every casual sound from the old house set my nerves on edge. The stairs groaned as I walked toward the attic, and I paused at the base of the spiral. A faint memory of that hidden chamber made my skin tingle with apprehension. I wasn't sure I wanted to go up there, but the alternative, living in constant fear of the unknown, was worse. I climbed slowly, one hand gripping the banister until my knuckles whitened. The attic door was closed just as I had left it. The overhead bulb was still on. Had I forgotten to switch it off the last time I came up? The light flickered once, then stabilized, but the effect made my pulse flutter. My breath came in shallow puffs, every board squeaked beneath me, each sound amplifying the quiet. At the far end of the attic, I saw the narrow door that concealed that sinister pie piece of wood. Anxiety squeezed my lungs like a vice. I had no logical reason to open it again. Yet the compulsion to confront it tugged at me when I finally gathered the nerve to slide the panel open. The cramped compartment was empty. The piece of wood was gone. A dull roar pulsed in my ears as confusion. Tangled with fear, no one else had a key to my house, and I certainly hadn't moved it. My eyes darted around the attic, scanning for any sign of a disturbance. Nothing. The dust looked undisturbed. A faint buzzing sound, maybe from old wiring, filled the silence, but it seemed to magnify the sense of being watched. My scalp prickled and my knees wobbled. I felt unsteady, as though the very floor might tilt and send me tumbling. The swirling dust particles seemed alive, mocking me in their slow dance through the stale air. Retreating down the stairs, I realized my breathing had turned shallow, and a cold bead of sweat trickled down the back of my neck. My heart pounded so forcefully that I half expected to see it rattle my shirt. My mind cycled through every rationalization. Maybe the landlord knew more than he let on. Maybe a maintenance worker had discovered the wood and removed it. Yet a small, insistent voice whispered that something else was happening. Something well beyond a human explanation. Over the following week, the nighttime noises intensified. Sometimes it was the sound of floorboards groaning as if someone paced back and forth directly above my bedroom. Other times, the scraping noise was so subtle it could almost be my imagination. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, with only the faint hum of the street lamps outside, my senses felt too heightened for it to be a mere trick of the mind. A menacing heaviness lingered in the house, creeping into my thoughts. Even in daylight, I grew jumpy, flinching at slight noises and feeling a dark presence just out of sight. My physical reactions became impossible to ignore. Goosebumps prickled my skin whenever I approached the attic stairs. My throat went dry, forcing me to swallow repeatedly. My heart seemed to batter my ribcage whenever I looked at that spiral staircase. Sometimes I broke into a run just passing it, desperate to escape the sensation of eyes boring into my back, yet every time I'd feel a cold draft chase behind me, almost like a breath from unseen lips. One particularly ominous evening, a thunderstorm rolled in, rattling the windows with violent gusts of wind. Flashes of lightning illuminated the dark interior of the townhouse, in split-second bursts contorting the shadows into eerie shapes. I had planned to ignore the attic entirely, but around midnight I heard an echoing thud from above my stomach. Twisted despite the terror hammering in my chest, I couldn't let my imagination run wild any longer. With shaky steps, I climbed upward, armed with nothing but a weak flashlight. Lightning lit the attic through a small window near the roof, revealing dusty rafters and spiderwebs glistening in sudden flashes. The thunder reverberated through the walls, making my heart pound and sink with its rolling booms with the flashlight. Beam cutting through swirling mows of dust. I navigated toward the small compartment door as I approached. My foot struck something on the floor. I looked down. It was the piece of wood. My name and the other etched names were still there, but something was different. The lines around my name appeared fresh, as if they'd been recarved. Tiny splinters of wood lay scattered around the inscription. A jolt of raw fear tightened my chest. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought I might faint. That was when I felt a presence behind me. Cold and heavy, my skin crawled with the certainty that I was no longer alone. I pivoted, shining the flashlight wildly, half expecting to see someone standing there, nothing but swirling dust. The space was absolutely silent, yet I could practically hear my heart threatening to burst through my ribcage. The air felt electric, charging with an intensity I could neither see nor explain. In the brief flickers of lightning, the attic corners seemed to warp and twist. My head felt light, my vision blurred. I stumbled backward, half collapsing against a stack of old boxes. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my lungs struggled to draw breath as if something pressed against my chest. I don't know how long I sat there panting in terror, but eventually I managed to scramble to my feet and gather enough resolve to grab the piece of wood. Holding it was repulsive, as though it radiated a vile energy, but I had to do something, anything, to break the grip of fear. I groped for the attic door, rushing back down the spiral staircase, nearly falling in my haste. Once I reached the ground floor, I shoved the panel to the attic shut behind me all night. I remained downstairs, huddled in a corner of the living room, the flashlight in one hand and that cursed piece of wood in the other. My heart refused to slow down for hours, and each subtle sound, the wind gusting the old pipes, groaning, made me snap to attention. Convinced I would see something lurking in the corner, the next morning brought a pale, weak sunlight, exhausted and shaken. I made a decision. I didn't fully understand what was happening. but staying there any longer in the grip of the suffocating dread was unbearable. I packed what I could into my car before leaving. I considered what to do with the wooden board. Part of me wanted to abandon it in the attic, yet I couldn't bring myself to leave it behind. The thought that it might reappear carved with my name in fresh strokes twisted my stomach, so I took it with me. My landlord didn't argue about my sudden departure, likely because he could see the desperation in my eyes. He offered no explanation, only repeating that old houses have stories we'll never fully understand. His voice was calm, but something in his gaze hinted at knowledge he preferred to keep hidden. I have not returned to that townhouse, nor do I plan to. Even now, far from its cramped halls and secret compartments, I cannot escape the lingering dread late at night. When I close my eyes, I sometimes hear the creak of those attic floorboards or feel the ghostly weight of a presence behind me. My chest tightens, my breath catches, and I'm confronted. Again by the memory of my name gouged into that ancient plank at times, I find myself questioning my own sanity. Did I imagine the entire ordeal? Was I simply overwhelmed by the house's age and the stress of a new environment? And then invariably I remember the final moment before I left. As I stood in the foyer, glancing one last time at the staircase, a subtle movement caught my eye. The attic door seemed to shift as if something on the other side was gently pushing it open. I froze, caught between terror and a morbid fascination. For a split second, I swear I heard a soft scraping like nails on wood. My name remained etched in my mind, accompanied by a chorus of other unknown names whispering in the silence. Even now, recalling that moment brings a wave of chills so powerful I can hardly breathe. I keep that piece of wood locked away, unsure whether destroying it would release me from its hold or unleash something worse. I feel its pull some nights, as though it wants me to return to that hidden place in the attic. The tens in my chest flares whenever I think of it. My breath turning shallow, heart palpitating despite my attempts to rationalize, to move on. There's a persistent dread that my name carved by unseen hands links me forever to whatever lurks in that cursed townhouse. I will never know exactly what manifested there. Was it a spirit trapped in the walls, a distortion of reality that latched onto my fears, or simply a cruel trick played by my own mind? The questions remain unanswered, and the uncertainty gnaws at my peace. I wake sometimes with the sensation that I'm still trapped in that attic, suffocating under its oppressive darkness, listening to whispers of footsteps that stop just shy of revealing themselves. Perhaps it is better not to know the truth, to let the shadows hold their secrets yet. I can't help but look over my shoulder in quiet moments, half expecting to glimpse a shape lurking at the edges of my vision. My name remains on that plank, carved in a past I cannot access, tethering me to a haunting that refuses to fade. And if there is one thing I've learned, it is this: some doors once open can never truly be shut again, no matter how many locks we turn or how far we run. A silent dread now follows me, reminding me that the darkest horrors are not always found in the realm of death, but can exist in the quiet spaces just beyond our understanding, etched into wood and mind alike. I still remember the first night I walked into the main aisle of that vast distribution center and felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. Something was immediately wrong, an impression of emptiness that felt neither normal nor inviting. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the endless rows of stacked boxes. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't quite explain why this place was supposed to be just another building, a warehouse where products were sorted, stored, and shipped. Yet from the moment I started working the midnight shift, I sensed there was something else here, lurking in the stale air and the echoing corridors. My name is Joseph, and I consider myself a rational man. I never believed in ghost stories or superstitions. I always told myself that facts and tangible evidence guide me. But every time I walked down one of those deserted aisles, I felt a sharp chill that didn't come from the temperature control system. I tried to chalk it up to exhaustion, or maybe an overactive imagination after all. Who wouldn't feel a little unsettled in such a massive, mostly empty place during the early morning hours? But it was more than that. I could sense something watching me, something that stayed just out of sight. I started noticing odd things happening within the first week while double-checking shipments. I would hear what sounded like distant footsteps. They were faint but distinct, like someone pacing around corners or walking parallel to me on the other side of the shelves. I would pause, hold my breath, and listen. My pulse would pound in my ears and my palms would get clammy. Then the footsteps would stop the first time it happened. I shrugged it off. I blamed my tired mind. But the sounds persisted on subsequent nights, and I realized I wasn't the only one hearing them. Some of my coworkers mentioned under their breath that they too occasionally heard pacing where no one should be. The corridors themselves felt endless. The towering shelves stretched so high that I almost lost sight of the ceiling when I looked straight up the forklift. Vehicles would beep in the distance, creating an eerie echo in the steel framework of the rafters. The overhead lighting was unreliable. Every so often, one of the fluorescent tubes would flicker, forcing my eyes to adjust repeatedly to the changing brightness. Sometimes late at night, when I did inventory checks, entire sections of the warehouse would go dark for a moment or two. A few seconds of darkness might not sound like much, but in a place like that, it feels like an eternity. My breathing would quicken and I'd feel my muscles tense up as if expecting something to leap out at me. Then with a pop, the lights would sputter back on, revealing only boxes and pallets. Yet I could never shake the sensation that I wasn't alone in those fleeting intervals of blackness. During one particularly quiet shift, I felt a sudden tug at the back of my shirt. It was unmistakable, a distinct pull as if someone had grabbed a handful of fabric. My heart slammed against my ribs and my hand flew to my chest. I spun around so fast that I nearly stumbled against the heavy crates. No one was there. All I saw were the silent rows of merchandise, perfectly still and lifeless in their piles. My pulse drummed in my ears. I stood there, mouth dry, scanning the space for any sign of movement. I thought maybe a loose plastic wrap or a stray piece of machinery had snagged my clothing, but I saw nothing that could have caused that feeling. My coworker later told me that the echoes in the building play tricks on you, making you think there's someone behind you when there isn't. But that didn't explain the physical sensation of cloth being pulled. I tried to put it out of my mind, convincing myself that it was some random fluke. However, my discomfort grew with each passing night. One of the floor supervisors mentioned that our own paranoia can get the better of us on night shifts, causing us to hear and feel things that don't exist. He spoke in a reassuring way, explaining that industrial buildings produce odd sounds, metal beams, contracting ventilation, ducts rattling loose pieces of the ceiling. Shifting, he insisted that all these noises can merge into a chorus of spooky background music when the place is almost empty. Despite his rational explanation, I remained uneasy soon. Odd. Whispering joined the phantom footsteps. At first, I assumed it was the sound of forklifts whirring in a far corner, or maybe the mechanical hum of the conveyor belts. But this was different. Late into the shift, when I was alone in a remote aisle, I could have sworn I heard hushed voices. They were unintelligible, more like soft murmurs than actual words, but they definitely sounded like people trying not to be heard each time. I would freeze my skin, crawling until I mustered the courage to investigate. Predictably, I'd find no one there. The emptiness that greeted me only made it more disturbing. A wave of goosebumps would ripple across my arms, and I'd feel my breath catch in my throat. The tension started to build inside me whenever I stepped foot in that building every evening. As I parked my car outside the tall metal gates, I felt a gnawing sense of dread. I'd steel myself with a long exhale, reminding myself that it was just a job, just a big empty building full of inanimate objects. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong in there, something not entirely of this world. My coworkers exchanged concerned looks whenever we shared EXP experiences of flickering lights and strange noises. Some confessed that they sometimes saw flickers of movement at the ends of the corridors like a silhouette. Vanishing behind a pallet, one said through hushed words that she felt an inexplicable breeze brush past her when no doors were open. All of this was said half-jokingly with forced smiles, as if we all wanted to dismiss the mounting evidence of something. Off, the paranoia crept up on me, slowly weaving its way into my thoughts. Whenever a corner loomed ahead of me, I found myself tensing mentally, preparing for something to jump out. My heart thudded harder whenever a stack of boxes shifted unexpectedly. If a coworker walked too quietly and appeared behind me, I would nearly yelp in surprise. My nerves completely frayed. It was maddening, constantly feeling like my senses were on high alert. I began sleeping poorly, tossing and turning, dreaming of labyrinthine Isis and unseen watchers who whispered my name. My body felt heavy, and I dreaded returning night after night to that place. The building's architecture only amplified my anxiety. It was built to maximize storage space, so corridors intersected in a mosaic pattern. The overhead beams were crisscrossed, creating a bizarre canopy of metal. Every small sound echoed across the structure, sometimes magnified, sometimes distorted. I started to think the place had a presence of its own, an entity formed by the vast emptiness and the waves of sound reverberating through it rationally. I knew that was a bizarre conclusion, but at 3 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by flickering lights and whispering vents, it felt entirely plausible. One night, a forklift malfunctioned in a distant corner, causing a loud grinding noise that made me jump so violently I dropped my clipboard. My hands trembled as I bent down to retrieve it. I told myself I was acting ridiculous, letting a simple mishap startle me like that. Then the lights in the aisle I was in began to flicker one after another, as if some invisible force was roaming down the road, extinguishing them. In turn, they popped back on after a few seconds, but those seconds seemed so much longer. My eyes strained in the darkness, anticipating movement that never happened, or at least I thought it never happened, because I had a distinct impression of a shifting shadow just at the edge of my vision sometimes after hearing me mention footsteps and flickering lights. A coworker would shrug and say that the building just breathed oddly. People joked about the warehouse having a life of its own, but beneath the surface there was fear in their eyes. We all felt the same tightness in our chests, the same dryness in our mouths, the same racing heartbeat. Whenever the overhead lamp started to stutter, a few folks confided that they couldn't wait for morning when the hustle and bustle of the day shift restored a semblance of normalcy. During daylight hours, the building was flooded with workers. Forklift engines droned constantly, and the sense of the uncanny receded into the background, but in the dark hours we were left exposed to it. I once found myself in the far corner of the storage area behind tall stacks of cardboard boxes, scanning barcodes for inventory. The place was dead silent except for my own labored breathing. Suddenly, a faint shuffle came from the next aisle. My heart thundered in my ears. I could actually feel my pulse in my fingertips, my throat constricting. I crept toward the sound, thinking maybe a coworker was there, but no one appeared. A stale breeze seemed to pass by me, carrying the faintest echo of breathy murmurs. Cold sweat trickled down my back. My eyes darted around, focusing on every shadow. It was then that I realized my surroundings felt subtly different, as if the boxes had shifted or the space had elongated. Turning into a corridor I didn't recall existing, the sense of disorientation was overpowering, making me question my own memory. My head spun with the possibility that the place itself was changing. While I wasn't looking over time, the whispering got more insistent. It was still unintelligible, but it felt closer. Almost right behind the shelves next to me. On some nights, I'd feel my breath catch as a flicker of movement crossed from one aisle to another. Vanishing the instant I turned my head, my rational mind fought back, telling me it was just a trick of the light, that my eyes were exhausted from long hours, but my gut told me something else. My hands would shake so badly that I could hardly hold the scanner. Sometimes I had to close my eyes just to center myself, forcing slow, deep breaths to calm the pounding in my chest. Rumors circulated among the night crew that a presence haunted the upper beams of the warehouse, watching us from above. I dismissed it as idle talk, a creepy story we told to amuse ourselves during coffee breaks. But one night I heard a distinct scraping sound coming from up there, a noise that traveled across the rafters overhead. My heart seized in fear. I looked up but saw only metal bars and flickering lights. Yet I swear I felt something looking back. Something whose stare prickled my skin like needles at the height of my paranoia. I decided I had to confront the situation. Whatever it was, my mind raced through the possibilities. Some intruder messing with us, a stray cat making noise in the vents, or maybe a coworker playing an elaborate prank. I reminded myself that no credible evidence of anything supernatural existed, but I also remember the tug at my shirt, the phantom footsteps, the whispers, and the flickering lights that seemed target determination and fear warred inside my chest. But my curiosity and desperation to put an end to this torment pushed me forward. If I found a rational explanation, maybe I could finally sleep again, so I took the longest, darkest corridor in the warehouse deeper into the less-used storage sections. This area was where older inventory was stashed, rarely touched. My pulse hammered at my temples and a faint ringing buzzed in my ears as I walked. I felt a pressure building in my chest like I couldn't take a full breath. The overhead lights here were sparse and entire stretches of aisle were cast in gloom. My footsteps echoed ominously, each step seemed louder, each breath more labored. Halfway down that corridor, the lights flickered, my skin went cold, and I braced for them to go out. They sputtered back into a dim glow, but in the distance, one light remained off, creating a dark, dark patch at the far end. Within that patch of darkness, I saw a shape. It wasn't clear or distinct, just a vaguely human outline. My heart raced so fiercely that I thought I might collapse. A wave of cold sweat drenched me and my breath became shallow. My hands shook uncontrollably. I tried to speak, but my mouth felt too dry to form words. Then, almost as if sensing my terror, the shape receded. Melting back into the shadows, my eyes widened, and I staggered forward, propelled by a mix of dread and grim resolve. When I reached the spot where it had been, I found nothing but boxes and silence. Yet I couldn't dismiss what I'd seen. An after-image lingered in my mind, a suggestion of something that shouldn't be there for a moment. I stood trembling in that aisle, struggling to gather my thoughts. My heart pounded, and I could feel the aiden and tingling in my fingers. I realized that there may never be a neat, logical explanation for what was happening. Maybe the building's design, with all its echoes and flickering lights, had opened a window for something we couldn't fully comprehend. Or maybe my own stress and exhaustion had led me to project horrors into the darkness. But the physical reality of the tug on my shirt and the shape I had just witnessed felt all too tangible. I knew I couldn't remain in that state of half-madness, tiptoeing around as if the aisles themselves might swallow me. I decided that I had to accept this place for what it was, an unnerving labyrinth that tested the limits of my reality. The next time the supervisor checked on me, I hinted that I suspected the building was harboring something. Beyond normal explanation, he responded with a calm practice speech about echo chambers and psychological suggestions, but I could see the slight twitch in his eye as if he also feared something lurked here. Eventually, I made peace with the truth that I could not debunk every incident. I realized there were no easy answers. The best I could do was confront the dread directly and refuse to be paralyzed by it. On my final shift, before taking some time off, I ventured once more into the darkest parts of the warehouse. I listened carefully to the distant whispers, felt the unnatural chill in the air, and even sensed that faint tug on my uniform again. My heart jackhammered and my muscles tensed, but I forced myself to keep moving, step after step, breath after breath. I marched through the corridor, determined not to run this time. By the end of the night, I was worn to the bone, but a strange calmness had settled over me. I had stood in the face of that unknown presence and refused to yield to blind panic, although I still felt unwelcome stares from behind boxes and heard hushed murmurs that seemed to follow me. I walked out of the building at dawn, drenched in sweat, yet oddly triumphant. I had chosen to meet the nameless fear head-on. I didn't defeat it, nor did I chase it away, but I claimed my own resilience. There were no answers given, no reassurance offered. I realized that sometimes the darkness holds secrets we can't understand, and we're left to cope with our own interpretations of the unexplainable. Now, whenever I recall those midnight hours, a chill courses through me. The memory of that place still sets my nerves on edge, as though something within those towering shelves and shadowy passages continues to watch me from afar. Yet I learned that true terror doesn't always appear in the form of dramatic apparitions or physical harm. Sometimes it's hidden in the pervasive, unsettling feeling that our world can twist into unfamiliar shapes when we least expect it, and in the end, it's up to us to decide whether to let that fear consume us or to confront it and walk away. Still trembling but unbroken.